Elohim is plural. There are those who will argue that it's the royal we, that it's not plural, it's in the sense of the Father, Son, the Holy Spirit, and it's the Trinity, and that's why it's plural Elohim. Like this in Bible Hub says, judges, scholars, like I said, Dan McClellan and others, it's kind of agreed upon that Elohim is only used strictly within a divinity sense and would not be represented within judges or of the mortal scale. Elohim will always be used in a form of divinity, and it's gods. It is plural. The I am is plural. Like I said, Elohim would be the deities. Malachim would be angels, emissaries, messengers. Malach would be angel. So you got this, and they'll argue, like I said, that it's some form of royal we, but that's not supported in the context or the text itself within the original Hebrew. And it is gods most of the time. Like I said, to briefly state that yes, I will concede that there are places where it is used singularly. An example, when one of them would say that Yahweh is their Elohim, the Elohim in that usage with articles of grammar would be a singular thing, but in tradition, context, in historical reasoning with the actual text, you will see that it is indeed plural and is indeed talking about a council, as is seen with you could see even with the faulty texts of today. So look, you got Psalms 82, and this is the King James Bible. King James Bible, Psalms 82. God presides in the great assembly. God standeth in the congregation of the mighty. He judgeth among the gods. How long will ye judge unjustly, and accept the persons of the wicked, Selah? Defend the poor and fatherless. Do justice to the afflicted and needy. Deliver the poor and needy. Rid them of the hand of the wicked. They know not, neither will they understand. They walk on in darkness, and all of the foundations of the earth are out of course. I have said, Ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. But ye shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for thou shalt inherit all nations. Now, see, do you see what that says even within the King James itself? And you can open it up and see it. So, it says here that God stands among the other gods. Okay? There's always this weird thing about big G and little g and the ramifications. It's nothing like that. And when you go into this is when you type that in, interlinear, uh, and it breaks it down. See, look. So a psalm of Asaph, Elohim. See, there's that im, Elohim. He stands and takes in a congregation of El, see El. There is a singular usage. And you see there is a singular usage. In fact, using El as the name of of a generic deity fits with the influence upon them from their genesis. Look, Canaanite origins of Judea. You just type it in, and I know Google AI isn't always accurate, and we're going to get into more. But look, it explains it to you. It's like archaeological and genetic evidence indicates that the ancient Israelites and the kingdom of Judea originated from within the indigenous Canaanite population of the late Bronze Age southern Levant. Israelites were not outsiders and who completely wiped out local inhabitants. Rather, they emerged from ruralized Canaanite or Proto-Israelite communities in the ancient highlands around 12,000 sorry, 1,200 to 1,000 before Common Era. So look, and I can go into different sources if you'd like, but you'll see that they developed, and the Israelites had developed from the Canaanites that are often mentioned. And you could see it further on in Like, look, for example, the Canaanite pantheon, you type it in. The Canaanite pantheon was a complex polytheistic system centered on the supreme sky god El, his consort Asherah, and the prominent storm fertility god Baal, who rose to prominence, leading to a divine council with other major deities like war goddesses Anat and Astarte, sea god Yam, and death god Mot, reflecting concerns for fertility, water, and the cosmos detailed in Ugaritic texts. Okay, so you see all that, and then there's more than just Psalms 82, and we're going to go into that, but more extra biblical Yahweh material. You got this. Couldn't tell it Hadrot in the Sinai, I guess, and Kerbet El Kom, Judah, 8th century BCE archaeological sites that yielded significant controversial Hebrew inscriptions mentioning Yahweh and his Asherah, dated to the Iron Age period, second period, I guess. These findings, along with accompanying iconography, suggests that some ancient Israelites, contrary to the later biblical narrative, did not practice strict monotheism and may have viewed Asherah as a consort or mother goddess associated with Yahweh. And they got the pictures, So Asherah, right? And you go into Asherah, you got that. You got another, and earlier it had mentioned, Astarte, and even Astarte is let me see. Astarte is mentioned in the biblical text as well, further proving the point that this is a Canaanite document. Astarte, often called Astaroth in the Bible, was a major Canaanite Phoenician goddess of fertility, sexuality, and war, widely worshipped across the ancient Mediterranean. Though often condemned in the Hebrew Bible as a false deity, her cult was highly popular, with worshippers referring to her as the Queen of Heaven. And of course, you have this context. You can combine it with the Babylonian context of who she is with cross literature. Ishtar or Easter. Ishtar is the paramount Mesopotamian goddess of love, fertility, and war, known as Inanna to the Sumerians and associated with the planet Venus as a central deity in Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian pantheons. She was revered for her immense power, often depicted with lions and worshipped through the ancient Near East. Of course, then you got to Inanna. And so you start to see that the rouge of monotheism really begins to falter. Elohim is most definitely plural, and we're going to go further with more evidence. Here we got Gods of the Bible by Mauro Bellino. A new interpretation of the Bible reveals the oldest secret in history. And Mauro Bellino is a former Vatican translator, and he had some of the oldest materials that the Vatican had to offer, and he directly translated them to the modern English of where he is in the Latin area. And then it eventually got translated straight to English. The bare bones, exactly what it says, is presented here, and he was actually quite impactful and influential. Mauro Bellino was he actually was a translator for, I do believe, the top uh, publishing authority of the Vatican at the time, and he got canned for basically this stuff. And he had revealed, of course, what the text had said in a proper literalist interpretation of what it actually says, and it actually makes a lot more sense. Of course, he's a proponent of the Sumerian ancient astronaut theory, but the thing about it is what he uses to connect it to Sumerian is accurate. Now, you can go into debating what he says in regards to Sitchin. There's valid criticisms of Sitchin. I get that. But this guy, like I said, he was a big deal. Elohim, what God means. Let us start with a few short pages devoted to the term for God. In particular, we ask ourselves, what does Elohim mean, God or not? We know what Elohim means to us today, or better, we know what it means to most translators of the Bible today. But the reality is that no one knows precisely what the word Elohim meant for the authors of the ancient biblical texts at the time in which they were written. Let us put it in more general terms. In the study of ancient languages, it is not uncommon to be uncertain about the primitive meaning of certain words. All of the ancient texts that we know we once stood in a cultural context that has disappeared forever, the contours of which are often vague and can be inferred only partially from the text itself. The point of philological and historical research is to bring to light concepts and aspects that have been taken for granted for so long that no one questions them anymore. Perhaps this logic would make more sense if we were to turn the question around and focus for a second on the concept of God rather than Elohim. Even if we accept that Elohim means God, we should ask ourselves, is our idea of God today the same as the concept of God that ancient Semitic peoples had thousands of years ago? Obviously, no. That said, the term Elohim in the Hebrew Bible entails multi-layered semantics that we will try to summarize in the following sections. It would be helpful to note, first, that Elohim is not the only term in the Bible translated as God. Conversely, Elohim is not always solved with God either. Let us thus take a closer look at the meanings that Bible translators ascribe to the word Elohim. Some of the hypotheses that scholars formulate in their books on the subject. The definition of such a term, as we shall see, is so uncertain that caution is really an indispensable attitude when moving on this ground. Some of the meanings biblical Hebrew dictionaries ascribe to the term Elohim are rulers, judges, gods, superhuman beings, angels, children of God, mighty ones, God, deity, godlike beings, those from above. God also often renders the biblical terms Eloha, Eloah. According to some scholars, this variant is a feminine singular form from which the term Elohim is derived. Others hold that the word Eloha, Eloah is derived from Elohim and not vice versa. This term is also used to refer to a foreign god. Another divine name that is found in the Bible is El, which is usually considered the singular form of Elohim. However, to some scholars, these are two distinct terms. El would be used to mean strong, powerful, an object of fear, or something to be accomplished. It can also mean chief or lord. The term Elohim, while always rendered with God by traditional translations, contains, in fact, the Hebrew ending of the plural. Monotheists claim that Elohim is singular despite the plural ending. However, it must be noted that Elohim is used in the Bible with both singular and plural verbs. So does it mean God or gods? Furthermore, it is often combined with an article. In Hebrew, the article in the singular and in the plural is the same. There is no distinction between the two, so we could either translate it to as the God or the gods. As noted, the article often precedes the term Elohim. It is not the same to say God or the God. This grammatical element alone proves that Elohim is not a proper name, but the designation of an individual within a larger group. I speak clearly and not in riddles. Having established the semantics area around the term Elohim is all but unequivocal. We are faced with an inevitable decision to accept doubt as our guiding light. The only possibility of understanding the complex questions surrounding the term Elohim arises not from dogmatic truths, but from analyzing the occurrence of the term in various contexts. A synoptic examination of the diverse instances in which the term is found can go very far into the attempt to get closer to the meaning in which the term Elohim was written and used in ancient times. Furthermore, we shall also consider the behavior attributed to the Elohim in the Bible, and at the same time, the behavior that people adopted towards the Elohim. We can't help noticing on the side that if the term Elohim referred to the unique and universal principle, the one God imagined by monotheistic theologians, we can't help noticing on the side that if the term Elohim referred to the unique and universal principle, the one God imagined by monotheistic theologians, then several dozen biblical passages would remain incomprehensible. Let us thus immediately clarify, as will result clear in the ensuing chapters and pages of this book, that in the Old Testament the Elohim are clearly and reoccurringly presented as a plurality of individuals. This will result clear not only from a grammatical perspective, but also from the biblical narrative itself, from the unfolding of the stories, and from the interaction between characters, even when read in traditional translations. It is no accident that the religious and spiritualist interpretations of the Bible are forced to consequently define many parts of as metaphorical, allegorical, poetical, mythical, esoteric, and so on. For traditional theologians and conservative religious leaders, accepting specific Bible passages is only possible through a prioristic introduction of hermeneutical categories often used to define the incomprehensible, such as the mystery of faith and esoteric initiatory concealment. With all due respect for differing positions, our method is different. We weigh carefully the concreteness of the Hebrew language and do not dismiss easily the very words of Yahweh, who affirms with unmistakable clarity, I speak clearly, not in riddles. Numbers 12:8. When read literally with a skeptical and open mind, the Bible is clear. The Bible speaks extensively about the Elohim. We read about their characteristics, personalities, deeds, intentions, and words. The combination of these data makes the hypothesis that Elohim denotes a plurality of individuals entirely plausible. Is Elohim plural or singular? I present in the interrogative form a problem that the Judeo Christian monotheistic exegists and the theologians always solve dogmatically. For them, there is no doubt that the term Elohim denotes the spiritual, transcendent, omnipotent, omniscient, and only God. Despite the plural ending, monotheistic theologians maintain that the term's meanings is singular. In the face of this thesis, two different attitudes are possible. The first attitude is to question the traditional interpretations on philological grounds. Experience, however, teaches that this choice leads to endless and unproductive disputes. It is often impossible, from a philological and linguistic perspective, to prove the absolute correctness of this or that position. Therefore, the contenders remain rooted in their beliefs. The second attitude, which I consider cleverer, consists of the deliberate acceptance of the traditional monotheistic thesis. By making this choice, one chooses to believe the opposing party's claims to be valid. So let us continue with this reverse process. Instead of challenging the traditional monotheistic positions, let us pretend these positions are valid, and we see what ensues. The rules, guidelines, interpretations, and grammatical norms elaborated by the monotheistic exegists have the purpose of helping the faithful to understand the Bible. Therefore, the most helpful behavior is precisely the application of these guidelines to the biblical texts. Let us examine some passages in light of the claim formulated by the exegists on the specific subject of the term Elohim. For theologians and traditional exegists, Elohim is a term that has a singular value and designates exclusively a precisely identified person, Yahweh God. They exclude multiplicity and the existence of other Elohim distinct from Yahweh. Let us start with an indisputable fact. Yahweh is often defined with the term Elohim, and he is more precisely identified as the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The dozens of times this statement occurs in the Bible always have a clear and unambiguous purpose to make it clear that Yahweh is the Elohim who deals exclusively with Israel and not with other people. Consequently, Israel must also address him exclusively. In view of this uncontrovertible theological fact, let us see how we can apply it to numerous biblical passages and check its intelligibility and congruence with the texts. For immediate understanding and in full respect of the texts, unless otherwise noted, we report in the translations the exact terms used by the ancient biblical authors. For example, Elohim, without suggesting any specific translations of them, which would require explanations and interpretations. In our view, this is the most correct and appropriate methodology to deal with texts that are not always solid from the point of view of philological reconstruction. A doubtful attitude avoids the risk of falling into this temptation, typical of dogmaticism, of replacing presumed truths with other and different presumed truths. This methodology also allows us to proceed with examples the reader can carefully verify with the Bible at their disposal. Genesis 6. Without further ado, let us start from a passage from Genesis, in which the biblical authors say that the sons of Elohim liked women and they would take as many of them as they pleased. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth and the daughters were born to them, the sons of the Elohim saw that the daughters of the Adam were beautiful. They married any of them they chose. Genesis 6, 1, 2. If the term Elohim refers to one and the same person, Yahweh God, how could he have children? If Elohim always referred individually to one and the same person, Yahweh God, why is the term Elohim preceded by the definite article the in Hebrew? If Elohim here refers to angels, as some traditional commentators claim, why did the biblical authors not use the common terminology for angels that is found in all other books of the Bible, namely Malachim? Why is there an explicit reference to children's/sons of the Elohim here? If these sons were men, why mentioned they married women? Who else would they marry? It is redundant and unnecessary information unless they were not men. All these questions are very difficult to answer if we read the biblical text from a monotheistic point of view, as theologians would like to do. But suppose Elohim denotes a plurality of individuals, both in the sense of their acting as a group, which is sometimes rendered in Hebrew by the verb in the singular, in the sense of identifying one of them as belonging to that group of the Elohim, Yahweh, then all the insoluble problems we have indicated above would disappear. The situation would become immediately understandable, but without needing explanation or interpretation. Genesis 31. The end of Genesis 31, which we urge the reader to read in its entirety, describes a tumultuous encounter between Jacob and his father-in-law Laban. After a harsh confrontation, the father-in-law and son-in-law erect a stone on which they swear neither will cross that line and with hostile intent against the other. To ensure compliance with the got it. Okay, sorry. To ensure compliance with this territorial pact, they invoke the Elohim in the following manner. May the Elohim of Abraham and the Elohim of Nahor and the Elohim of their father judge between us. Genesis 31:53. Nahor was Abraham's brother and Laban's grandfather. We thus have proof that Abraham's family was divided and followed and worshipped different Elohim. We thus learn that there were the Elohim of Nahor who ruled in Mesopotamia, where Nahor dwelt with his family, and the Elohim whom Abraham had followed into the land of Canaan. Incidentally, the reader must know that in Genesis 20:13, Abraham says, "Well, Elohim had made me wander from my father's household." The verb had is found in Hebrew in the plural form. Therefore, it is the patriarch himself who employs the verb in the plural. He was following more than one Elohim. We also note that in the Italian edition of the Jerusalem Bible, EDB 2013, the passage in quote in the passage in question, Genesis 31:53, is correctly explained in a note. The gods on both sides are called as witnesses, as customary in ancient treaties. The Bible does not report an extraordinary event, but a general custom. Nothing unique about this act of law was sanctioned by the presence of the powerful, who ruled on both sides. Jacob and Laban acted in absolute conformity with the norms of the time. The passage is fascinating, however, in relation to the question of the Elohim, since it reveals two self-evident aspects: the plurality of individuals called to ensure observance of the oath and their absolute parity. There is no distinction between the supposedly true God and other unidentified Elohim. It is precisely the clarity of the situation described that raises questions for monotheistic theological exegesis. If the term Elohim always individually refers to one and the same person, Yahweh God, how can other Elohim endowed with the same dignity and power be asked to take an oath? If Elohim individually always refers to the same person, Yahweh God, how can Nahor feel guaranteed by a non existent Elohim who would be completely helpless compared to the protection granted to Abraham by none other than the Almighty God? Did Nahor, Abraham's brother, and his family not know the difference between one God and their Elohim, who do not exist according to theological teachings? Did Nahor and his people not know that their closest relatives had a relationship with the Almighty Elohim God? Did they never realize the difference between the two Elohim? Have the two brothers ever had the opportunity to compare? On the other hand, the true God of Abraham, and on the other hand, idols made of inert stone. Did Abraham never encourage his brothers and nephews to abandon their childish, primitive, ineffective, and unproductive worship of rocks to approach the only true God he was fortunate enough to know? Is this even possible? However, if the term Elohim indicates a plurality of individuals and their actions as a single group, all the questions above become irrelevant. The situation becomes immediately understandable and clear without needing explanation or interpretation. Moreover, their acting as a group would also explain the use of the verb in the singular in several occurrences. Given the concreteness of the ancient Hebrew language, which had no fixed grammatical rules, but tended primarily to describe situations in concrete terms. Genesis 32. The story described in Genesis 31 takes an exciting development in Genesis 32. After erecting the stone, and once the oaths and promises have been made, Jacob continues his journey, and he walks on the street. He encourages two messengers of the Elohim. When Jacob saw them, he said, "This is the camp of Elohim," so he named that camp Machanaim. Genesis 32:2. Now, Machanaim is a term written in the so-called dual form. It thus means two camps. The situation is clear. Jacob arrives at the place where he finds two military camps with the troops who defend their respective borders, who therefore acted as guarantors. If the term Elohim always refers individually to the same person, Yahweh God, how could Elohim have two camps? Why would Yahweh God even have two camps? If Elohim always refers individually to one and the same person, Yahweh God, doesn't everything seem entirely absurd? However, if the term Elohim indicated a plurality of individuals and their actions as a single group, all all the questions above have become irrelevant. The situation would again become immediately understandable without the need for explanations or interpretations. Exodus 3:12-15. In this passage, The Elohim speaks to Moses. He wants to provide him with more information about his mission and goals. Moses learns to what he is told. Moses listens to what he is told. However, is unsure with whom he is dealing. It needs to know precisely. Thus Moses asked Elohim, Behold, I go to the Israelites and say to them, The Elohim of your fathers has sent me to you. And they will ask me, What is his name? What will I answer then? If the Elohim of the fathers was one, how could Moses have doubts? If the term Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, how could Moses, the greatest of the prophets, have doubts about his identity? If the term Elohim of the fathers was one and only God, how could the Israelites have doubts about his identity? What we have previously read in Genesis 31 and 32 makes us understand that Moses had reasons to ask this question. He want oh, He wanted to know which of the Elohim he was dealing with, because he did not know, and obviously it was possible, if not easy, to make a mistake. If, on the other hand, and is clear from the biblical text, the term Elohim denotes a plurality of individuals, our question becomes irrelevant. Moses' strange request to know the identity of the Elohim becomes perfectly sensible. The situation becomes clear without needing explanation or interpretation. Exodus 15:11. After their deliverance from Egypt, the Israelites sing a song of joy to Yahweh, praising him with the exclamation, Who is like you among the Elohim? Exodus 15:11. If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, the people's song of triumph, who is like you amongst the Elohim, sounds absurd. If Elohim always refers to Yahweh God in the singular, how could they make such an inexplicable and ridiculous statement? But suppose that Elohim refers to a plurality of individuals, this question becomes irrelevant, and Songs of Joy of Exodus 15:11 becomes understandable without needing explanation or interpretation. Exodus 18. Moses' father-in-law, whose name is Jethro or Ruel, comments on Moses' success in leading the Israelites out of Egypt. He expresses his joy and admiration by exclaiming, Now I realize that Yahweh is greater than all of the Elohim. Exodus 18:11. If the term Elohim indicates Yahweh God in the singular, how can God be greater than all of the Elohim? Why is Elohim accompanied in Hebrew by an adjective meaning all, everyone, each? What is the point of using this adjective of if only one exists? Why does an article precede the term Elohim? What did Jethro mean? What did he mean that Yahweh is greater than all the judges? One of the terms one of the terms used by commentators to justify the plural ending of the term Elohim. Can one imagine a more blatant banality than this? Suppose instead the term Elohim denotes both a plurality of individuals and their actions as a group. The above questions become irrelevant and the passage becomes understandable without needing an explanation or interpretation. Exodus 20. In enumerating the Ten Commandments, the alleged God begins with an assertion that leaves no room for interpretation. I am Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other Elohim before me. If the term Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, why does the one and only God need to specify that he was the one who brought them out of Egypt? Could there have been any misunderstanding or doubt about his identity? If Elohim is Yahweh God in the singular, why does Yahweh say that there shouldn't be other Elohim using the plural adjective Acharim, which means other, different, foreign? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, how could one think that the people, as soon as they come out of the state of subjugation in Egypt, could turn to other Elohim whose existence they were not aware of and could thus not even imagine? However, if the term Elohim indicated a plurality of individuals and their actions as a single group, all the questions above become irrelevant, and Yahweh's order becomes immediately understandable without the need for an explanation or interpretation. Moses speaks to his people and admonishes them. You shall not follow other Elohim among the Elohim of the nations around you. Deuteronomy 6:14. If the term Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, why does the Hebrew text have the plural adjective akarim, which means other, different, foreign? If the term Elohim means Yahweh God in the singular, how can Moses demand not to follow other Elohim among the Elohim of the surrounding nations? It goes without saying that when one chooses among, it means that the choice is made within a plurality of individuals, at least two. Otherwise, common sense tells us that there is no possibility of choice. If we want to say that the term Elohim means judges, as theologians and monotheistic exegetists claim, we have to admit that Moses thought his people were naive enough to hesitate between God and very ordinary human judges. However, if the term Elohim indicated a plurality of individuals and their actions as a single group, and all the questions above become irrelevant, and the quoted passage becomes understandable without needing explanation or interpretation. Deuteronomy 13. We read here a sequence of commands given to the Israelites. They are told how to behave in various situations concerning Yahweh. If your very own brother, or your son or daughter, or the wife you love, or your closest friend secretly entices you, saying, Let us go and worship other Elohim, Elohim that neither you nor your ancestors have known, from Elohim of the peoples around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other. Do not yield to them or listen to them. Show them no pity. Do not spare them or shield them. You must certainly put them to death. Your hand must be the first in putting them to death, and then the hands of all of the people. Stone them to death, because they tried to turn you away from Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Deuteronomy 13:7-11. If the term Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, why does the Hebrew text have the plural adjective akarim, which means other, different, foreign? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, how could other Elohim be addressed? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, how could there be the possibility of following other Elohim chosen from among the Elohim of the surrounding peoples? Why this real, concrete, tangible fear on the part of Yahweh, who goes so far as to order the murder of even the closest family member who incites treason? If someone claims, however, that the term Elohim in this case means judges or inherent pagan idols, then we note that Yahweh considered his followers so naive as to hesitate between him, the supposedly omnipotent God, and very human judges, or even worse, ridiculous piles of stone or wooden stakes. However, suppose the term Elohim denotes a plurality of individuals in their actions as a group, all of the above questions becomes irrelevant, and the passage becomes understandable without needing explanation or interpretation. Deuteronomy 32. This chapter is traditionally called the Song of Moses, and contains numerous passages that, in their extraordinary clarity, contribute to understanding the concreteness of the biblical story. We invite the readers to read Deuteronomy 32 from the first verse. Here I examine two passages of this chapter that are particularly effective for understanding the plurality of the Elohim. In verse 8 and 9, El Elyon, the one above, the commander of the Elohim, assigns the peoples the territories they are to settle. Yahweh receives the inheritance of the family of Jacob, which, as the Bible says, was wandering lost in the wilderness. having not even received the allotment of a specific territory. When Elion gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the people according to the number of the sons of Israel. For Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob has allotted inheritance. In a desert land he found him, in a barren and howling waste. Deuteronomy 32 8-10. Verse 12 is particularly interesting for our investigation. Yahweh alone led him, no foreign El was with him. Moses then expresses all his anger at the people of Israel, who often betrayed the commitment made with Yahweh and turned to other Elohim. Moses even pointed out that they sacrificed to Shedim, who are not Elohim, whom they did not know, knew recently come from nearby, whom your fathers had not feared. Deuteronomy 32:17. Moses expresses his deep resentment that the people put themselves in the service of Shedim, who were not even Elohim. These Shedim were individuals belonging to a lower hierarchical rank, probably equivalent to that of the Assyro-Babylonian Shedu. They probably acted as intermediaries between the people and the Elohim. If the term Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, why does verse 12 say that Yahweh led Jacob alone without the help of a foreign El? How could this possibility even exist? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, how could Moses claim, verse 17, that there were Elohim new recently come from nearby? Who were these Elohim recently come from nearby? And from where did they come? If Elohim in this case, as some claim, just means judges/legislators, then we must take note of the fact that at that time some unknown judges roamed the land, and that the people of Israel were unable to comprehend the difference between God Almighty and some ordinary judges, legislators, and chose the latter. How can you mistake the one Almighty God for some human judge? But we learn from Sumerian Akkadian texts that some of the Elohim did not receive any territory or people in the course of the assignments made by the commander of the Elohim, the biblical Elion of Deuteronomy 32. However, if the term Elohim indicated a plurality of individuals and their actions as a singular group, all the questions above become irrelevant, and the situation becomes understandable without any need for explanation or interpretation. Joshua 24. Joshua succeeded Moses as leader of the people of Israel. When the conquest of the land of Canaan was imminent, he gathered the tribes of Israel at the Shechem and summoned the elders. Joshua's goal is to reconfirm the covenant between the people of Israel and their Elohim. Above all, he wants to verify the intentions of the Israelites. Joshua delivers a speech containing many interesting elements for our analyses. In verses 1 to 13, Joshua reminds the people of all the interventions and wonders Yahweh has done for them since their exit from Egypt. Then he tells them, "Now fear Yahweh and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the Elohim your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh. But if serving Yahweh seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether Elohim your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates, or Elohim of the Amorites, in whose lands you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve Yahweh." Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake Yahweh to serve other Elohim. It was Yahweh our Elohim himself who brought us and our parents up out of Egypt, from the land of slavery, and performed those great signs before our eyes. He protected us on our entire journey and among all the nations through which we traveled. And Yahweh drove out before us all the nations, including the Amorites, who lived in the land. We too will serve Yahweh because he is our Elohim." Joshua said to the people, "You are not able to serve Yahweh. He is a holy Elohim. He is a jealous El. He will not forgive your rebellion and your sins. If you forsake Yahweh and serve foreign Elohim, he will turn and bring disaster on you and make an end of you, after he has been good to you." Joshua 24:14-20. First of all, we again find the use of the plural adjective achrim, which means other, different, foreign, that we have previously met. Here again we find a reference to the plurality of the Elohim of the fathers, which fully justifies Moses' request to Yahweh to make himself known in Exodus 3:12-15. Given the plurality of the Elohim and the uncertainty about their identity, there was the possibility that they could be confused with one another. In particular, we learn that the patriarchs served other Elohim when they were in Egypt. It is clear that Abraham and his followers who had come to the land to escape starvation could do nothing but serve the Elohim who ruled them. We also learn that in the land of Canaan, where the Amorites lived, there ruled Elohim different from Yahweh, and different from those who ruled in Mesopotamia, where the family of Terah and Nahor, Abraham's father and brother respectively, resided. Nahor is the same Nahor we find in Genesis 31, whose Elohim vouched for the pact between Jacob and Laban about territorial boundaries as we have seen above. Joshua's injunction not to turn to other Elohim and the reference to the responsibility that will fall on the transgressors, who must repay every treachery with their blood, are repeated at length. Yahweh declares himself without a shadow of doubt to be a jealous El. Finally, in verse 19, the Bible uses the term Elohim and El interchangeably. This wording shows again how the biblical authors use the term as synonyms. Speaking of Yahweh, Joshua says, he a holy Elohim, he a jealous El. Biblical authors wrote that Yahweh was an Elohim, meaning that he belonged to the group of the Elohim. If the term Elohim is unequivocally Yahweh God in the singular, who were all the other Elohim mentioned as possible and dangerous rivals? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, why does the Hebrew text again have the plural adjective acharim, which means other, different, foreign, associated to the term Elohim? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, then why did the patriarchs not worship him as Lord, even when they were in Mesopotamia and Egypt? Why, when in Egypt and Mesopotamia, did they instead follow other Elohim who did not exist according to monotheistic theology? Had Abraham and his followers so quickly forgotten the only true God? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, why were there other Elohim in Canaan, the so-called Promised Land? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, how could he be jealous of other Elohim who did not exist according to monotheistic doctrines? If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, why did the biblical authors who, when naming Yahweh, feel the need to specify that he is the Elohim of Israel, or the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? From whom did they want to distinguish him, since he was the only one? However, the term Elohim indicates a plurality of individuals and their actions as a singular group. All the questions above become irrelevant, and the situation becomes intelligible without needing further explanation or interpretation. 1 Kings 11. In this passage, prophet Isaiah informs Jeroboam that Yahweh has decided to take the kingdom out of Solomon's hands and give it to him. They have forsaken me and worshipped Ashtaroth, Elohim of the Sidonians, Shamash, Elohim of the Moabites, and Milcom, Elohim of the Ammonites. 1 Kings 11:33. The statement is clear. There are other Elohim for whom Solomon, the wisest of all men, built places of worship. That these other Elohim existed is also documented in Judges 11:24. Here the commander of Israel's forces addresses the king of the opposing army and tells him, "Will you not take what your Elohim Shamash gives you? Likewise, whatever Yahweh our Elohim has given us, we will possess." Judges 11:24. If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, how can there be these other Elohim who are explicitly named in various places in the Bible? If Elohim is Yahweh God in the singular, how could the wise Solomon have other non-existent Elohim build places of worship? How could the wisest of all men not see the difference between the Almighty God and the non-existent stone idols? If Elohim is always Yahweh in the singular and represents the only God, how could the commander of Israel's forces grant the non-existent Samash the right to give land to other people and grant them the right to keep the land they received? However, if the term Elohim indicated a plurality of individuals and their actions as a singular group, all of the questions above become irrelevant and the situation becomes immediately intelligible without needing further explanation or interpretation. 2 Kings 5. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Aram, suffers from a skin disease that the prophet Elijah manages to cure by recommending him a series of baths in the water of the Jordan. This result is considered a miracle due to the intervention of Yahweh, who worked through his prophet. Naaman thus promises not to offer a sacrifice to any Elohim other than that of Israel. The Hebrew expression he uses again contains the adjective that we have already seen occurring several times. In connection with the term Elohim, that is, Acharim, which means other, different, foreign, Naaman says that he will no longer offer sacrifices and offerings to any other Elohim but Yahweh. Verse 17. Here again it is confirmed that Yahweh belongs to the other group of Elohim. Naaman, too, shows that he knows that the Elohim are many still. Of all possible Elohim, the general chose to address himself exclusively to the Elohim of Israel from that moment. Even if we want to admit that Elohim is a concept of a singular value, we must still note that besides Yahweh and the other Elohim mentioned in the previous sections, there was another Elohim named Rimon, whom the Bible quotes in the following verses. Ramon was one of the names of which Hadad, the Elohim who ruled over Damascus, was identified. Naaman makes a rather strange request to the prophet Elijah, who makes an even stranger concession to the newly converted general. May Yahweh forgive your servant for this one thing. When my master enters the temple of Rimon to bow down, and he is learning on my arm, and I have to bow there also. When I bow down in the temple of Rimmon, may Yahweh forgive your servants for this. Go in peace, Elijah said. 2 Kings 5:18-19. General Naaman had just converted to Yahweh, the only God, and yet asks the prophet for permission to bow down to Rimmon, another Elohim. The confirmation that the Elohim are a group, a multitude of individuals, are indeed numerous. Jeremiah 7. Yahweh warns Jeremiah not to try to intercede for people guilty of an offense that cannot be forgiven. The children gather wood, the fathers light the fire, and the women knead the dough and make cakes to offer to the Queen of Heaven. They pour out drink offerings to other Elohim to arouse my anger. Jeremiah 7:18. If Elohim is singular, why is it accompanied in Hebrew by the plural adjective achrim? Other, different, foreign, which includes the female Elohim Astarte. Perhaps the definition of Queen of Heaven refers to her. If Elohim is always Yahweh God in the singular, how could people prepare offerings and libations for other Elohim and thus insult him? Who were these Elohim, since they did not exist according to monotheistic doctrine? Had Yahweh forgotten that the worship of other Elohim had been advocated precisely by the wisest of men, Solomon himself? If instead the term Elohim alternatively identifies both the plurality of these individuals and their actions as a group, all the questions above becomes irrelevant, and the situation is understandable without the need for explanation or interpretation. Counting the Elohim. Let us examine and test the Judeo-Christian exegesis rule to interpret the term Elohim. They claim that the term Elohim is just an indefinite superlative, a plural of extraction, a plural of majesty, a plural of sovereignty, a plural of excellence, a plural of intensity, and therefore must be translated in the singular. All these definitions were elaborated to explain the biblical use of the plural form Elohim to convey a singular meaning that identifies the individual entity God, who is supposed to be unique according to the monotheistic view. With this concession, we will try to summarize the most important passages of the Old Testament in which at least one Elohim is mentioned to determine the total number of Elohim in the Bible. We find out that there is at least one Elohim, accepting him as a singular individual who makes the atom and his female. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual whose sons mate with the atomite females. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual who presents himself to Abraham with the name El Shaddai. One Elohim, accepting him as a singular individual who presents himself to Jacob. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual named Yahweh, who has a relationship with Moses and his people. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual to whom Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, compares to Yahweh. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual, represented by the golden calf built in the desert during the Exodus and called Elohim. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual who rules over the family of Nahor, Avram's brother who stayed in Mesopotamia. One Elohim, accepting him as a singular individual who rules in Egypt and to whom the family of Abraham returns, as we have read. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual who rules over the Amorites. One singular Elohim, accepting him as a singular individual who has two camps seen by Jacob. One Elohim, accepting him as a singular individual whom Yahweh expressly forbids to serve. One Elohim, accepting himself as a singular individual who rules over the nations around Israel. One Elohim, accepting him as a singular individual from whom Yahweh decides not to receive help in leading Jacob's family assigned to him by Elion. One Elohim, accepting him as a singular individual named Shamash, who rules over the Moabites. One Elohim, accepting him as a singular individual named Milcom, who rules over the Ammonites. A female Elohim, accepting her as a single individual named Astarte, who rules over the Sidonians. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual named Rimmon, who rules over Damascus. A new Elohim, accepting him as a single individual who has recently arrived, and to whom the Israelites dedicate cultic acts that anger Moses. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual, presiding over an assembly that must be imagined to have had at least two other Elohim present to be defined as such. Psalms 82. One Elohim, accepting him as a single individual to whom the Israelites offer sacrifices at the time of Jeremiah. The reader who reads the Bible with a calm and open mind will understand that in many of the passages quoted, the text undoubtedly refers to many Elohim. Let us only think of the assembly of Psalms 82, where several dozen must have participated, whereas in our brief exposition we have enumerated only 3. However, since we want to give credit to the Judeo-Christian monotheistic exegesis, consider only one Elohim for each of these listed situations. We counted a total of 23 Elohim. If we also allow the interpreters to combine Elion, El Shaddai, and Yahweh into one person, plus the El who met Jacob, Genesis 35, we arrive at 20 Elohim. We then ask ourselves, given a large number of Elohim mentioned in the Bible, present and active in a relatively small area, we then ask ourselves, given a large number of Elohim mentioned in the Bible, present and active in a relatively small area, is it surprising that the term has a plural ending to refer to the group or the actions of the group as a whole? Do we need to find, elaborate, and invent all sorts of explanations to justify the plural form of the term Elohim? With all we have said, we would be stunned if Elohim was not in a plural form. The application of the hypotheses established by the exegesis, stating that the term Elohim is undoubtedly singular, leads to the following consideration. Should the term Elohim have a singular value, the Bible would be an absurd, incoherent, confused, and almost incomprehensible text. On the other hand, if we are to affirm the non-theological hypotheses that the term Elohim refers not to an individual but to a plurality of individuals, to a group of individuals, then the text would be clearly understood by everyone without the need for mediation and interpretation. It is also clear that in this second case, the supposed spirituality of the Old Testament would lose any raison d'etre. It would lack any foundation. Therefore, theologians and monotheistic exegetists cannot accept it. Are the Elohim immortal? Immortality is not a concept in the Bible. Indeed, it does not even apply to the Elohim, who undoubtedly enjoyed a very long life in earthly years. They even passed it on to the antediluvian patriarchs, but they were mortal beings. The sacred text explicitly says so. Psalms 82 describes an assembly of the Elohim for the advocates of the traditional doctrine Elohim equals God. Psalm 82 poses a real problem because the term Elohim cannot be traced back to the singular here. This psalm actually speaks of an assembly of the Elohim, who are therefore necessarily many and are accompanied by pronouns, adjectives, and, above all, by 10 verbs in the plural form. The only one who presides over the assembly, Elion, is very angry with the Elohim because they do not rule as they should. He ends his rebuke with a statement that leaves no room for doubt. I said, "You are Elohim. You are all sons of Elion, but you will die like Adam. You will fall like every other ruler." Psalms 82, 6-7, my boy. Elion established a clear distinction between Elohim and Adam. This can only mean that the Elohim do not belong to the lineage or group of the Adamites, and thus they must be reminded that they die like Adam. The specification is only necessary because Elohim and Adamites are distinct groups. Otherwise, it would make no sense. Professor Michael S. Heiser is an American Old Testament scholar who earned a Ph.D. in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2004 and an M.A. in Ancient History from the University of Pennsylvania. He is also the editor of the Logos Bible software platform. Professor Heiser writes a few things that I will summarize here for simplicity's sake. The Elohim are not human beings. They are very different beings from the Adamites. They live much longer than the Adamites, but they are nonetheless mortal. The assembly spoken of in Psalms 82 did not even occur on earth. Further comment is unnecessary. Conclusion. In summary, the Bible reveals to us the following characteristics of the Elohim. The biblical term Elohim did not refer to one spiritual, transcendent, omniscient, and omnipotent God, but to many flesh and blood individuals. We call them individuals because as we have seen, they are not Adamites either, so they are not men. The Elohim lived long enough to be considered immortal, even though they were not. They were individuals who traveled on flying machines called Ruach, Gavad, Merkava, and Cherubim. We shall see in the context, as we shall see in the next chapters. The Elohim were never considered gods in the conventional sense. They were objects of respect and inspired terror, simply because of their great power, guaranteed by the technology they possessed. The Elohim did not concern themselves with issues such as religion in the modern sense of the word, spirituality, or life after death. Their goal was to define the power structures in the various territories where different civilizations were developing. The Elohim knew the laws of nature and the cosmos and passed them on to their most devout followers, creating castes of kings, governors, priests. The Elohim knew the laws of nature and the cosmos and passed them on to their most devout followers, creating castes of kings/governors/priests, the so-called initiates. The Elohim had the same privileges and attributes as Yahweh in terms of functions and powers exercised because they belonged to the same group. Yahweh was only one of them. The Elohim were originally also, at the same time, as anticipated in the previous section, legislators. They dictated rules, regulations with full decision-making autonomy. Governors, they took care of the many aspects of power. They enforced the laws directly or through their agents and delegates, such as Jethro, Moses, and so on. Judges, they controlled the observance of the laws, imposed and enforced punishments, or had them enforced. Finally, some people object that the term Elohim could indicate a group of influential men, i.e., a group of normal men or possibly evolved Adamites. No special translation of the Bible would be required to realize that this perspective is incorrect. The Bible we have at home provides sufficient Elohim. These were distinct types of individuals. Let us look at some of these elements. The Bible notices that the Elohim had recurrent sexual intercourse with the Adamite women, Genesis 6. If they had been ordinary men, possibly powerful ones, such as legislators, rulers, or kings, would it be a platitude even to mention the fact? On the other hand, biblical and extra-biblical literature extensively reports this interest of the Elohim in the Adamite women. We discuss this in more detail in chapter 4. The Bible also tells us with great emphasis that the Elohim made the Adam. Then, again, how would this make any sense if we consider the Elohim just as ordinary men? It makes sense only because the Elohim were not normal men. Therefore, it was necessary to devote not a small number of pages explaining that a particular group of individuals had created the Adam. Likewise, we read in Psalms 82 that the Elohim die like all Adams. If the Elohim had been just normal men, would it have been necessary to recall such a self-evident fact? All men die. As mentioned above, the Elohim lived very long lives that would make them look immortal from a human perspective. However, immortal they were not. They die like Adam. Elion, the most important of them all, reminds the Elohim group of this fact during assembly, a council. This alone proves that the Elohim were more than one. In fact, they were a multitude. Otherwise, there would be no council. Finally, the Elohim seem to have special neurophysiological needs, such as inhaling the smoke produced by burning fat prepared with the modalities minutely prescribed in Leviticus 3:3-5 and other biblical passages. This smoke calmed them. We discuss this in chapter 8. Before moving forward, let us make a clarification. In case where an article or singular verb is attached to the term Elohim, we attribute the actions described in that specific section to the particular Elohim that is the protagonist of the events described in the Bible, Yahweh. We thus intend to avoid the alternating use of El singular and Elohim plural, which could lead to confusion. Finally, we have deliberately chosen to mark the term Elohim with the initial capital letter Elohim, even though grammatical correctness would dictate a lowercase letter. Tradition has accepted this method, and we have adopted it. From now on, we also free the term Elohim from inverted commas. Okay, so there you go. That's just one perspective from, like I said, Marvelino. This guy, he worked for the top translation and publisher for the Vatican, and he got canned for basically making this shit. I mean, it was before this book, but he's been, talking about it. But this is not the only one we're going to go to. I'm going to read it from, so I can have another source, not just one. This is The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues by Dan McClellan. Of course, he's a Bible scholar. He's got multiple studyings and so forth. I like his material. But he's got the scholarly approach. And I was going to read an excerpt. The Bible says there's only one God. The many gods of the Hebrew Bible. If you start carefully reading the Bible from Genesis 1:1, you might run into something a little confusing before you clear the first chapter. Verse 26 says, "And God said, let us make humanity in our image, after our likeness." Wait, who's us? Who is God speaking to? A very similar statement is found in Genesis 11:7, where God sees the people building a tower and says, "Let us go down and confuse their language." Again, God seems to be speaking to others. Christians like to read these passages as references to the Trinity, but no one ever interpreted them that way until the invention of the concept of the Trinity began more than 600 years later in the 2nd century CE. See chapter 17. Others suggest God is talking to angels, but the broader context doesn't really support that, at least not in a way that protects the notion that there's only one God. In Genesis 3:5, the serpent tells Eve that eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil will open their eyes, making her like gods, knowing good and evil. The serpent is just lying, though, right? No. The serpent statement is verified in verse 22 when God states, "The human has become like one of us, to know good and evil." See chapter 4. The us that God keeps referring to is other gods. The consensus view among scholars is that these were other gods of the divine council, the deliberate body of gods that made decisions about the oversight and functions of the universe. These gods are referred to again in Genesis 6 2-4, where we find this odd story of the sons of gods. The Hebrew here is B'nai Elohim, which could mean a couple of things. If Elohim is understood as a reference to the God of Israel, then B'nai Elohim are God's own divine offspring, likely born of God's consort or wife Asherah. See chapter 6. If the word Elohim is understood generically to refer to plural gods, then the phrase is similar to saying daughters of humanity or sons of the prophets. It's a Hebrew turn of phrase that refers to a member of a group by calling them a son or a daughter of that group. Although it's in Aramaic, this is precisely how Nebuchadnezzar refers to the fourth entity he sees in the fiery furnace with Meshach and Abednego, a son of gods, Daniel 3:25. In other words, a god. It's not a reference to Jesus. Remember, this is a Babylonian king living more than 500 years before Jesus was born. According to either understanding, the B'nai Elohim of Genesis 6 were other gods. Later traditions would reinterpret these sons of gods as angels and later even as humans. According to the authors/editors of Genesis 6, though, a group of gods decided to come down to earth and to sire demigods' children with the humans. This represented a gross violation of the boundary that separated the human and the divine, and this odd little story seems to have been placed where it was to make it sound like God had sufficient motivation to destroy his creation with the flood. The B'nai Elohim pop up in other places that some scholars think they may be among the oldest portions of the entire Hebrew Bible. Deuteronomy 32 8-9 read as follows. 8. When Elion apportioned the nations, when he separated the children of humanity, he set up the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the children of God. And Yahweh's portion was his people. Jacob was his share of the inheritance. In the King James Version and other more traditional translations, verse 8 refers to the children of Israel, not the children of God. This is how the traditional medieval Hebrew Bible manuscript known as the Masoretic text reads. But the Septuagint reads, the number of angels of God, because scholars have long known that the Septuagint translators like to translate the phrase children of God as angels of God, as in Job 1:6 and 2:1, that they suggested the Hebrew source text of the Septuagint probably referred to the children of God. A fragment of a manuscript of Deuteronomy discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q Deuteronomy, preserves exactly this reading, confirming that hypothesis. This passage indicates that the nations of the earth were divided up according to the number of the children of God. On the surface, the text seems to be identifying Yahweh as one of those children of God. After all, you inherit property from someone else, not from yourself. There are some other clues within this idea of the number of the children of God. The text doesn't tell us precisely what that number was, but for a few different reasons, scholars are pretty confident that it was 70. To begin, this makes sense of the traditional texts, variant readings, children of Israel, since Genesis 46:27 and Exodus 1:5 state that Jacob, Israel, fathered 70 children. Also, Genesis 10, often referred to as the Table of Nations, lists 70 descendants of Noah, and these descendants are the eponymous ancestors of the nations that were understood to exist at the time of the text's initial circulation. The highlights as interesting parallel to the Ugaritic literature written in Syria north of Israel between 1400 and 1200 before Common Era. A text called the Baal cycle refers to the second tier deities of their pantheon as the 70 children of Athirat. In Ugaritic literature, Athirat, equivalent to the Hebrew Asherah, is the consort or partner of the high god El, who is also repeatedly referred to as the father of those same deities. In other words, El and Athirat were the high deities who procreated the traditionally numbered 70 deities of the pantheon. It seems Deuteronomy 32 8-9 are identifying the patron deities over the 70 nations of the earth as the children of Elion, the Most High. Deuteronomy 4:19 is also a reference to this tradition, but it was written much later than Deuteronomy 32 8-9, and the roles are changed a bit. In Deuteronomy 4, it's not Elion dividing up the nations to the gods, but Yahweh dividing up the gods to the nations. The gods in Deuteronomy 4 are also referred to as astral bodies, the sun and the moon and the stars and all the host of heaven. These passages are explaining why each nation has their own patron deity who was responsible for overseeing and defending their nation. The patron deities would later be demoted to the status of guardian angel, referred to in the Enochian literature as watchers. We see this tradition of each nation having a guardian angel to fight its battles for it in places like Daniel 10:13-21 and 12:1, where Michael, Israel's prince, fights against the prince of Persia and the prince of Greece. There's a fascinating story about the other gods in 2 Kings 3 that relies on this framework of patron deities having sovereignty over their own nations. Verse 4 tells us the king of Moab had been paying an annual tribute to Jehoram, the wicked king of Israel. Mesha decided to throw off their vassalage, though, and refused to pay tribute. Jehoram formed a coalition with the Judahite king Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom to invade Moab as punishment. Their first attempt failed miserably, and then they regrouped and sought guidance from Elijah, a prophet of Yahweh. Elijah wasn't happy about helping Jehoram, but agreed to seek Yahweh's direction only because of his respect for Jehoshaphat. According to Elijah's prophetic guidance, the coalition was to run a very Assyrian-like scorched earth campaign that would ruin the land, stop up the walls, and destroy every fortified city. Elijah declared that Yahweh would provide the necessary resources and would deliver Moab into your hands. An unmistakable promise that the coalition would be successful in crippling the nation and extracting compensation from it to cover the lost tribute and the cost of the campaign itself. This time, the coalition's invasion initially went according to plan, and they successfully carried out their prophetic instructions until they arrived at the Moabite city of Kir Hareseth. The coalition surrounded and attacked the city, and battle looked like it was going their way. 2 Kings 3:26-27 describe what happened next. When the king saw that the battle was too strong for him, he took 700 swordsmen with him to break through the king of Edom, but they could not. Then he took his firstborn, who would rule in his place, and he offered him as a burnt offering upon the city wall. Then there was great fury against Israel, and they withdrew from against him and returned to the land. The word for fury used in this passage is kitseth, which refers to divine fury, whereas fury everywhere, it occurs in the Hebrew Bible except for two later Persian period prose couplets, which are unrelated to the usage in 2 Kings. The author seems to be suggesting some kind of divine fury drove the coalition out of Moab, but what deity could be the source of it? Elsewhere, the word refers to Yahweh's fury, but it just doesn't make sense for Yahweh to suddenly become enraged at Israel as a result of the Moabite king's human sacrifice. Some scholars have argued that Israel must have somehow participated in the sacrifice, thus angering Yahweh. Others suggest Israel must have been so repulsed by the sacrifice that Moab was allowed to gain the upper hand, thus angering Yahweh. Still, others suggest the great fury must have referred to Israel's horror as the sacrifice, which led them to declare that they were leaving because this place is dead anyway. Devotional and academic readers alike have ginned up all kinds of scenarios to help interpret this passage in a way that skirts the plain meaning of the text, but the simplest explanation, the only one that does not require conjuring up details that are not in evidence. The sacrifice successfully catalyzed the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Shamash. He drove the coalition out, frustrating the Yahwistic prophecy. I would agree with the rhetorical question posed by the influential Protestant theologian Walter Brueggemann in his commentary on First and Second Kings. The only conclusion to draw is that the Moabite god Shamash is motivated by the sacrifice and is activated on home ground against the invaders. By presenting the story this way, the author can offer a terse yet plausible excuse for the historical fact that they can neither ignore nor misrepresent. Israel lost. It turns out the other gods not only exist, but without home court advantage, Yahweh might even lose to them in battle. Psalms 82 is frequently held up as another very early recognition of the gods of the nations. The first verse is pretty explicit. God took his place in the divine council. Among the gods he judged. Despite what many people think, the Hebrew word Elohim, which translates gods, is not used in the Bible to refer to human judges. The psalm goes on to represent Yahweh condemning other gods of the divine council to mortality for their neglect of cosmic order and social justice. Some scholars have argued the psalm is incredibly early and, like Deuteronomy 32, represents an original distinction between Yahweh and the Most High. I don't think that's what's going on. In 2018, I published a paper in the Journal of Biblical Literature arguing that this psalm is actually pretty late and is attempting to restructure the Judahite understanding of the divine council and the patron deities. Here's what I think is going on. Psalms 82 makes the most sense as a reaction to the Babylonian exile. Babylon's invasion of Israel and the forced migration of the people of Judah represents a failure of cosmic order and social justice, which has come about because of the negligence of the gods of the nations. This is the basis of Yahweh's accusations. And verse 5 describes the outcome of this negligence for the nations of the earth. They do not know and they do not understand. In darkness they wander. Shaken are the foundations of the earth. In verses 6, 7, Yahweh passes judgment on the gods of the nations, condemning them to mortality and effectively deposing them from their seats on the divine council. This leaves a vacuum in the divine patronage over the nations of the earth, and this is where the psalmist comes to cry out in verse 8. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, you inherit all nations. Calling on Yahweh to inherit all nations responds to the crisis of people of Israel being outside the land of Israel, Yahweh's inheritance, and not being able to worship him. This notion that you cannot worship God outside of the nation of Israel is reflected in a number of pre-exilic texts. The Syrian general Naaman, for instance, wants to worship Yahweh when he is back in Syria, but because Yahweh can only be worshipped on Israelite soil, Naaman takes 2 cartloads of Israelite soil home with him. 2 Kings 5:17. When Saul is pursuing David near the borders of Israel, David complains that Saul's men have driven me out today from Yahweh's inheritance, saying, "Go worship other gods." 1 Samuel 26:19. The exiled Judahites in Babylon couldn't worship God unless something changed. In light of Yahweh's general restriction to the land of Israel, it seemed to me that Psalms 82 was an attempt to rearrange the divine council and renegotiate divine patronage over the nations to extend Yahweh's sovereignty to all the nations of the earth. This was the universalization of Yahweh. The gods were thus deposed and dismissed, but because they remained an integral part of Israel's scriptural heritage, they did not simply disappear. Nothing compares to you. When most devotional readers of the Bible hear that scholars believe that Bible recognizes the existence of other gods. The first and frequently only stop on their tour is Deutero-Isaiah, which is a fancy way to refer to Isaiah 45:5, widely believed to be a post-exilic addition to Isaiah. These chapters are quite emphatic about the impotence and irrelevance of the gods of the nations, and they use a few different pieces of rhetoric to get this across. The most common has Yahweh asserting that he is God, or Yahweh, or I am he, and then that crucially there is no other, or there is no one besides me. Isaiah 44:6, 44:5, 6, 18, 22, 46, 9. According to the traditional reading, this means that there are no other gods apart from or besides Yahweh. There are multiple problems with this reading, though. To begin, while it's subtle, the author of Deutero-Isaiah does refer to the gods of the divine council. Isaiah 40:25-26 tells the audience to look up to the sky and rhetorically ask, who is it who marshals the celestial bodies to their ranks? The unspoken answer is obviously Yahweh. This evokes the imagery of the gods as Yahweh's celestial host or army, or in perhaps one of the oldest passages in the Hebrew Bible, Judges 5:20. The stars are gods who fight against Sisera from their courses in the heavens. Isaiah 45:12 similarly identifies Yahweh as the one who stretched out the heavens and commanded their hosts. Deuteronomy 4:19. Discussed above similarly refers to the sun, moon, stars, and all the host of heaven as the gods of the nations that the hearer looks up to the heavens to see. Next, the author of Deutero-Isaiah puts very similar rhetoric in the mouth of the personified Babylon. In Isaiah 47:8 and 10, Babylon declares, I am, and there is no one besides me. The personified Nineveh says the same in Zephaniah 2:15. It really doesn't make sense to interpret this as the cities claiming to be the only cities in existence. The rhetoric only really lands if we understand the authors have these cities declaring themselves to be the only cities that matter to their people. In other words, the Hebrew phrases translated "besides me" don't mean anywhere in all the universe apart from me, but something more like next to me within the rhetorical scope that has been established by the context. In the case of the cities, the context would be the extent of their geographic and demographic sovereignty. The context of these statements in Deutero-Isaiah is Yahweh's deliverance of Israel. This is why the terms Redeemer and Savior are used in such close connection. Yahweh is basically telling Israel they better not give credit for their deliverance to any other god but him. And this is precisely what we read in Isaiah 43:12. I am the one who decreed and delivered and declared, on not some stranger among you. Translations render the Hebrew word for stranger as strange God. The point is not to say that no other gods exist, it is to say that no other gods matter. There's an additional dimension of Deutero-Isaiah's rhetoric that confirms this. Deutero-Isaiah repeatedly uses the rhetoric of incomparability. Nobody compares to Yahweh. Isaiah 46:9 makes this pretty clear with some poetic parallelisms. I am God, and there is no other God. I am God, and there is no one like me. Saying, there is no other, doesn't deny other gods exist. It just asserts that Yahweh is so far above the other gods. Similar rhetoric is found in several other places, like Exodus 15:11, which rhetorically asks, who is like you, Yahweh, amongst the gods? Psalms 29 calls on the children of God's B'nai Elohim to ascribe glory and strength to Yahweh. Yahweh is the God of gods in Psalms 84:7, and a great king over all gods in Psalms 95:3. Yahweh is said to be exalted over all gods in Psalms 97:9, and revered over all gods in Psalms 96:4, and 1 Chronicles 16:25. Psalms 89:6 rhetorically asks, who can be compared to Yahweh among the children of the gods, B'nai Elohim? repeatedly crowing that Yahweh is exalted as a god and a king over all other gods. Isn't that big a flex if your audience thinks the other gods are non-existent figments of pagan imaginations? The reason this rhetoric is effective is precisely because the audience understood the other gods to exist, and because it actually means that something to insist Yahweh towers so far above the patron deities of the gigantic empires next door that they can be dismissed as powerless and inconsequential. The more exalted the power and significance of the degenerated deities, the more powerful their rhetoric of incomparability. Boasting about being exalted as king and god over figments of others people's imaginations is utterly impotent rhetoric. The rhetoric of incomparability was increasingly critical, though, as Judeans found themselves on the business end of larger empires whose deities had an awful lot more capital in the marketplace of worship, and their ethnic identity was to survive. They needed to represent their deity not just as a competitive, but as incontestable. They didn't just need pros on the field. They needed an Elway, Davis, McCaffrey sharp lineup with a Schlereth and an Elon thrown in and a Shanahan stalking the sidelines. While some scholars might draw a sharp line between exclusivity and incomparability, I would suggest that I would suggest they're just different flavors of the same rhetoric. Both of these senses are also found in the much older literature of profoundly polytheistic ancient Southwest Asian societies. For instance, the great Cairo hymn of praise to Amun-Ra, composed between 2000 and 1500 before Common Era, says to Amun-Re that you are the sole one. You made all that exists, one alone who made that which is. It also praises Amun-Re as a unique one, like whom among the gods, unique king, like whom among the gods, and creator and maker of all that exists. A hymn to the Mesopotamian moon deity Sen begins, O Lord, chief of the gods who alone is exalted on the earth and heaven. It later continues, King of kings, exalted whose decrees none rival. No god is alike unto thy divinity. Even though Baal was defeated in battle multiple times and was subordinate to the high god El, the rhetoric of incomparability is used in Ugaritic literature to praise him. The rhetoric of exclusivity and of incomparability is just rhetoric, and it's pretty common rhetoric. Finally, while Deutero-Isaiah is frequently held at the threshold of a strict philosophical monotheism, it's not the only place where this rhetoric is found. We see it in the book of Deuteronomy as well, but scholars tend not to point to that book as the threshold to monotheism. Why not? Because the texts that use that rhetoric also explicitly acknowledge the other gods. For instance, Deuteronomy 32:39 has Yahweh declare, See now that I am He, and there is no other God with me. That sounds just as definitive as Deutero-Isaiah, but in addition to what we have in verse 8-9, see page 158, verse 43 goes on to say, Worship him, all you gods. So there is no other rhetoric can be used in close connection with the explicit acknowledgement of other gods. It's just rhetoric. I believe there are angels among us. During the Hellenistic period, a large-scale renegotiation of the heavens got underway among the authors and audience of the Bible and related literature. As I mentioned above, the exile incentivized authors to universalize Yahweh so he could be accessed beyond the borders of Israel. Psalms 82 deposed the divine council to achieve this, but the scriptural heritage of the Judeans and later Jewish communities continued to talk about God's heavenly council and hosts army, so further negotiations were necessary. Another step was to reinterpret the gods of Genesis 6 as angels. We see this in the Enochian literature and in the Septuagint, which liked to translate the Hebrew for gods into Greek as in angels. Now, angels were still considered a type of deity, but a lower ranked one, so it aided in the heretical exaltation of Yahweh. The gods of the nations got squished down into the bottom tier of the pantheon. The main ones were identified as angels, but there were also spirits and demons and other divine forces that occupied the same space. There was now Yahweh all the way at the top and everybody else at the way down at the bottom. Identifying gods as angels seems to have normalized this understanding, and that enormous gulf separated the God of Israel from the motley crew of other divine characters mentioned in the scriptures, which made acknowledgement of the other gods less discomforting for some authors. This may be why Dead Sea Scrolls text, like the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice, repeatedly refer to the holy ones, angels and spirits and Elohim, gods. Another rather fragmentary Dead Sea Scroll, manuscript 11Q13, also known as 11Q Melchizedek, insists that the word Elohim, God, in Psalms 82:1 is not referring to the Yahweh, but to Melchizedek, as it is written about him in the Song of David, which says, "A God takes his stand in the council of El. In the midst of the gods he judges." The New Testament isn't nearly as liberal as the Dead Sea Scrolls with its reference to other gods, but the gods are still acknowledged in a variety of ways. The divinity of angels is recognized, although they are represented as more clearly subordinate to the contingent upon God. Malevolent divine beings are almost unilaterally described as demons, but even then, these are acknowledged as gods in the scriptures of the earliest Christians. For instance, in 1 Corinthians 10, 19, 20, Paul quotes Deuteronomy 32:17 to demonstrate that while idols are nothing to others, to offer them sacrifices is to offer sacrifices to demons. So what am I saying? That food offered to idols amounts to anything? That idols amount to anything? No. That what they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I don't want you to become partners with demons. Rather, Paul was translating from the Hebrew or quoting the Septuagint. The very next clause in Deuteronomy identifies the recipient of the sacrifices a second time. To gods that they didn't know, Paul was quoting scripture that explicitly identifies demons as gods. 1 Corinthians 8:4-6 is a critical passage for understanding Paul's position. The rhetorical context is whether or not the Corinthian followers of Jesus should be participating in feasts involving food sacrificed to idols. Paul is going to argue that there is nothing inherently wrong with the food that has been offered to idols, but that not everyone knows this. If those who know better eat such foods in the presence of followers of Jesus who don't have the knowledge, it could cause problems. Paul states, regarding the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and that there's no God but one. While there are so-called gods in heaven and on earth, as indeed there are many gods and lords, for us there is one God, the Father, whom all things are, and for all things we are, and for whom we are, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things are, and for whom we exist. 1 Corinthians 8:4-6. Now, many people understand Paul to be denying the existence of other gods and to be affirming the philosophical monotheism they associated with the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, which Paul is modifying. But I and many other scholars would suggest the argument is quite a bit more nuanced. We've already seen in 1 Corinthians 10 that while Paul agrees that the idols are nothing in this world, they're still linked to demons. Paul acknowledges the reality of demons, which are explicitly identified as gods in the very same verse from which he partially quotes. As a result, I would suggest that for us there is one God. It doesn't mean we believe that only one God exists. It means only one God matters to us. These demonic powers are likely to be identified with every ruler and every authority and power, mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15:24. These are forces Jesus must destroy before handing over the kingdom to God the Father. Several other passages in the New Testament make similar references to powers in connection with divine forces. For instance, Romans 8:38-39 lists angels, rulers, and powers as things that won't be able to separate Jesus' followers from God's love manifested through Jesus. Ephesians 6:12, which probably wasn't actually written by Paul, denies the Christian struggle is against flesh and blood. Instead, it's against rulers, powers, cosmic rulers, and spiritual forces in heavenly places. 1 Peter 3:22, definitely not written by Peter, says that Jesus has gone into heaven to be on the right hand of God, with angels and the authorities and powers subjugated to him. For Paul and several other New Testament authors, the universe is replete with divine forces, both benevolent and malevolent. Sure, they're gods, if you want to call them that, but the New Testament authors prefer to refer to them in other ways. The angels are subordinate to Jesus and have their divine role to play, but those that are opposed to God and his kingdom will ultimately be defeated and destroyed in the end times. This cosmology represents only an incremental elaboration on the notions that came before guardian angels over the nations and before that patron gods. Conclusion. Early Israelite, Jewish, and Christian concepts of the gods were informed by the interaction of their received traditions, their scriptural heritage, and their needs, circumstances, and goals of their time and place. In the earliest periods, there was a lot less sunlight between Israel's pantheons and those of the surrounding nations. But as they had to fight for their identity and for their survival, it was continually renegotiated to create increasingly strong and meaningful boundaries between themselves and those around them. This was particularly the case as they began to be oppressed by larger empires that offered powerful deities as worship alternatives, and in some cases sought to annihilate their ethnic identity. Continually exalting Yahweh and continually debasing the gods around them became the go-to rhetorical tactic. But even as their understanding of Yahweh and their titles for the divine forces around them changed, their identification as gods was preserved in the scriptures they passed down from earlier generations. That identification wouldn't be explained away until well after the text of the Bible had all been composed and their authors had been all passed on to some variation of divine status themselves. From beginning to end, the Bible refers to and recognizes the existence of other gods. Dan McClellan, being a Bible scholar, multiple degrees. I provided you with a scholarly opinion and a respectable, reputable opinion of someone vested and studied and someone who made it to being a translator for the Vatican at the largest institute of publications. So, there's two different people saying it. Of course, you have Elohim. So, yeah, it's definitely plural. So let's show further. There was also representations of Yahweh where he was depicted with an abnormally large phallus. There's a lot of phallic imagery and a lot of things. It's just interesting because you find a lot of like little trinkets and figurines, and he's just got like a very large phallus sexualizing Yahweh. Of course, it was discussing the Canaanite origins of Judea. We talked about the pantheon a little bit. Of course, there's Baal, right? And, you got your traditional gatekeeper conspiracy theory, low-hanging fruit. Those people who believe the Illuminati consist of, like, celebrities, Satan, and all this other shit. Baal being, Baphomet being an actual being and not a metaphorical alchemical process, with lunar energy. These people have no idea. They think it's they have this really weird pantheon that's been completely made from bullshit. But we'll go into Satan here in a minute. But Baal, you hear all this shit about conspiracy theories, making him like the big bad. Although a terrible being, this is just run of the mill. So you got Baal was given accurate. Look at this is according to Besco. I don't know if I want Besco's research. Baal was most often portrayed as a strong warrior and was considered the god of storms and fertility. He was said to rule from his palace atop Mount Zephon, the highest peak in Syria. Baal is referenced several times in the Bible's Old Testament, where he's depicted as the main rival of the God of the Israelites. Of course, you've seen many times El. And Baal and El have a lot of myths that Yahweh cultists. El and Baal have a lot of myths that were taken and made into the Yahweh cult. Things were attributed to Yahweh, such as being a consort of Asherah, and the whole story of Yahweh's fight with the only actual close thing to antagonist Satan figure in the texts, that being the Leviathan. The Leviathan is a massive, a chaotic sea monster from the Jewish and biblical mythology, symbolizing untamable forces or enemies, often depicted as a multi-headed serpent or dragon. It appears in the Hebrew Bible, Job, Psalms, and Isaiah as a demonstration of God's power, a challenge to be a challenge to human understanding, or a future adversary to be defeated, and later became associated with demons and the sin of envy in Christian tradition. Yahweh's battle with this being is seen Isaiah 27:1. In day that will punish Yahweh with his sword, severe and great and mighty, on Leviathan the serpent fleeing, and Leviathan serpent that twisted, and he will slay. See, you got it there. This is ripped off from Baal and Lotan. Leviathan is just a reskin of Lotan. Lotan is a seven-headed coiled sea monster from Canaanite mythology, often representing chaos and serving as a precursor to the biblical Leviathan. As a servant of the sea god Yam, it is defeated by the storm god Baal. It is also identified as a biblical character, son of Seir, in a modern kibbutz in Israel. Of course, it's part of the good Ugaritic texts. He is a part of the Baal cycle. Lutan is defeated by the storm god Baal, Baal Hadad. It says it right here. Lotan is widely considered the predecessor to the biblical Leviathan, which is described as a sea monster to be defeated by Yahweh in Job and in Isaiah 17:1. We were hearing about the enslavement in Babylon. And you listen to military people, they'll tell you, or anybody who studies, it only takes 2 generations, maybe at most, maybe 3, completely at most, to completely brainwash a generation to the point where the grandparent is mocked by the grandchild for believing something that did happen. But at that point, the propaganda has gotten to them. And then at that point, you've converted to a completely different and foreign society. It doesn't take long at all. So you just imagine that on top of already evolving from Canaanites, the northern and southern kingdoms, Israel and Judea, having also being enslaved in Babylon, developing the Talmud, you know, not to mention, talking about extra biblical, the Torah, right? So there's the Torah and the books of Moshe, then the Tanakh, most of the books that you would consider are in the Old Testament, right? The Torah, Talmud, Zohar, Kabbalah, and so forth. The Torah being so fundamental to all Abrahamic faiths and specified as the core of them all, you got all these texts that the Bible ripped off. You got the Atrahasis. The Atrahasis is an account of the creation of humanity, their near destruction and flood, and the origins of many human plights, including plagues, droughts, miscarriages, stillbirths, infertility, and other tragedies. It explains why the world functions the way it does in Mesopotamian culture. Okay, there you go. Another one. Get the Enuma Elish. It tells the story of how the universe came into being, a great struggle among the gods, and the creation of the world and humanity. Epic of Gilgamesh. Yet another. The Epic of Gilgamesh tells the story of King Gilgamesh of Uruk, a powerful but tyrannical ruler who, after forming a deep friendship with the wild man Enkidu, embarks on heroic quests, but is ultimately confronted with the inevitability of death after Enkidu's demise. Okay, so but there's elements of this story are lifted and adapted into the Bible. The Genesis, the oldest known Mesopotamian text recording the creation of humanity and a great flood, originating from Sumerian polytheistic beliefs around 1600 before Common Era. The narrative details the gods crafting humans and establishing cities, and after deciding to destroy them, depicts the deity Enki advising the hero, Ziusudra, to build an ark and survive. See, got yet another one. So you see, the Bible has all these things lifted, on top of really being a henotheistic, meaning, oh, there's many gods, but there's one God focus, or higher than the others. In the hierarchical structure, there's a pantheon, the mention of the kingdom of the Elohim, and so forth. And even though this is not related directly to this mythology, heavenly bureaucracy, or the celestial bureaucracy, Chinese celestial bureaucracy mirrors earthly government structures with the Jade Emperor at the top. This divine hierarchy includes various gods, immortals, and officials who manage different aspects of the universe and human life. You can do comparative mythology studies, and you can really you can actually chart every fucking one of these gods to every major pantheon around the world. You can find a way to legitimately trace it back with close enough examples of certain beings, incidences, and roles and things that happen, and you can connect it all straight back to Sumer. The Elohim Council appears to be, the highest of that part of the caste system. You got the Malachim, the angels emissaries, what it was speaking of, the Shadim. You have the Seraphim, which I think is Seraph means, I think, yeah, Seraph translates to reptile, I do believe. You got all types of shit. So there's a lot of things that you can easily tie together if you really invest yourself in studying these things and doing intense thought and comparing the mythologies. I think I need to pivot. So, a lot of people believe in Satan. After all, you look at the book, you crack it open, it shows the name. Well, if you actually look at the Hebrew text, you know the context, you understand, you look at scholars, they will agree. There is no being named Satan in the book. I know that's hard to believe, but there's a whole thing behind it. So, back to Mauro Bellino's Gods of the Bible. What does Satan mean? Satan is especially notorious and infamous among all angels. He is the devil par excellence, the source of all evil and the adversary of God. This seductive spirit wants to influence the soul of the believers and away from them, and sway them away from the virtuous path. In theology and popular piety, Satan is an angel who rebelled against God and was therefore cast out of heaven before the creation of humanity. In the New Testament, Jesus says he saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Luke 10:18. The theologians also point to Ezekiel 28:14-18 and Isaiah 14:12-17 to support this view. We will address the biblical passages from Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14, and Luke 10 to show that the claim for this representation of Satan is once again arbitrary. Identifying the biblical Satan with the devil is incorrect and misleading. This chapter also deals with the figure of Lucifer, with whom Satan is always identified, to the point that the two figures overlap. We will see that this identification is also ungrounded, and there is, in fact, no correspondence between Satan and Lucifer against the background of the biblical text. We will show how far theology and popular piety have gone in portraying the spiritual figure that has no basis in Scripture. Let us start by saying that Satan in ancient Hebrew means adversary. The word Shaitan denotes a specific role and function in society, much like the term Malach. Angel represents a particular function, the role of a messenger. The fact that the article often precedes the word Satan proves beyond doubt that Satan is not a proper noun. As with Elohim and Malachim, the word Satan simply indicates a status or task. The examples below will clarify the various meanings of this word beyond doubt. Satan as a man. First of all, we show that the role of Satan is not necessarily an attribution of angels or Malachim. This contradicts the idea that Satan was originally a fallen angel from heaven. We have already seen how the word angel cannot be translated with Malach. We now see that the fallen angel's feared and supposed leader in the Bible is often a man, and more accurately, a function assumed by a man. Therefore, it has nothing angelic about it. Satan could very well identify the position, the actions, or the role of a man, a human being. 1 Samuel 29. In this biblical passage, we learn that David is an ally of the Philistines, but the Philistines believe that they cannot trust David and send him away. Refusing to give or accept military support from him, they decide to expel David from their ranks, 1 Samuel 29:4. And he won't be for us like Satan, adversary. The commanders do not want to run the risk of suddenly finding themselves on the enemy side of battle. They do not want to have David and his army as an adversary, Satan. 1 Kings 11. In 1 Kings 11, a story is told of an Edomian named Hadad who, after David's death, rises up against Solomon. The verses say, Satan against Solomon, Hadad. Yahweh raised up against Solomon an adversary, Satan, Hadad the Edomite. 1 Kings 11:14. Here, too, this adversary is undoubtedly a man. 1 Kings 11:23. Again, the Elohim raised against Solomon another adversary, Satan, Rezon, son of Eliada. Rezon, son of Eliada, is clearly a man, not an angel, nor a spiritual being. 2 Samuel 19:23. David is trying to save the life of a man named Shimei, whom others would rather put to death. Turning to them, David urges them to comply with his decision and exclaims, Why will you be for me today a Satan? David thus identifies other people as adversaries, Satan against them. Again, no angels in sight. We have quoted several passages in which the term has a precise meaning and undoubtedly refers to a man as an individual or a group of people. Satan as a malach. We already said that the malachim are not angels in the sense that we understand them today, at least in the sense theologians understand them. However, the malachim, the messengers of the Elohim, can also assume the function of Satan, or, as shown, the function and role of adversaries. The concept of adversary is maintained when the term Satan is applied not to men but to the malachim. In the book of Job, the figure of the Satan takes on considerable significance. It performs several important actions that can be summed up in the role of accuser and tempter towards the pious man. The Satan here acts like an enemy towards Job to prove that his devotion is motivated only by the material wealth the Elohim gave him. One day, says the Bible, the sons of the Elohim stood before Yahweh, Job 1:6, and came also the Satan among them. It is strange enough that, as we have seen before, the sons of the Elohim appear before Yahweh, which clearly means that the Elohim were many. But it is even more surprising to find out that there's one among them who has function of Satan. We saw in Genesis 6 that the sons of Elohim united carnally with the Adamite women. Now we discover that one of them had a special role and function. He was a Satan. Let us see what happens. The sons of the Elohim thus stood before Yahweh, and the Satan was among them. The article before the word Satan reveals that the biblical authors did not intend to refer to a specific person, but to one of the sons of the Elohim. He was part of the group of the sons of the Elohim, namely the one who will assume the role of Satan. We could compare the role/function of the Satan to that of the modern prosecutor. We will only analyze part of the story of Job here. However, we recommend that everyone read the book of Job, since it is undeniably one of the masterpieces of world literature. We merely want to point out that in verses 1, 6, and 7 of chapter 2, the term repeatedly occurs with the article as in Ha-Satan to indicate that one of the sons of the Elohim was probably appointed to be the Satan, the prosecutor. Be as it may, the reader can see at this point that the Satan does not act against the will of God, but in accord with it. This important point must be emphasized. The Satan acts in accord with Yahweh, not against his will. No matter how unpleasant and evil his work is, Yahweh approves of it and demands it to be done. So the Satan does not act as a leader of a group of rebellious demons. He is not a rebel, but a high-ranking official with a specific task. He must fulfill his duty to put Job to the test. He acts in complete agreement with his superior, Yahweh, who commands him to act freely, with the only precaution not to kill Job. Zechariah 3:1-2. A similar unpleasant task is performed by the Satan, once again with the article in Zechariah 3:1-2. In this passage, the Satan stands at the right hand of a Malach to file a complaint against the high priest Joshua. The verses briefly described a trial from which the defendant is acquitted and exonerated. The Malachi, the defending angel, asked Yahweh to reprimand the accusing Satan and express words of hope for Joshua, who is invited to continue in the future according to the prescribed ways. Psalms 109. The protagonist of this section is an unhappy man who asks Yahweh to free him from his enemies and to subject his persecutors to a severe judgment by placing a Satan, that is, an accuser, against him. Here, too, the figure of the Satan is not seen in opposition to the divine activity, but rather is presented as an executor expressly requested and sent to restore justice. Chronicles 21:1. The Satan here acts like a seductive enemy and puts David in a difficult situation by persuading him to do something that is entirely displeasing to Yahweh. He persuades him to take a census, which triggers the wrath of the Elohim and the consequent punishment, which is then withdrawn. Numbers 22. We have another account in Numbers 22 where the Satan operates as a representative of Yahweh. This episode proves that the traditional depiction of the Satan as the leader of the rebellious angels and the Lord of the underworld is unjustified. This is the story of Balaam, narrated in Numbers 22. Balaam was a soothsayer who was active when the Israelites were in the plains of Moab, east of Jordan, after 40 years of wandering in the desert. The Israelites had already defeated the kings of the Amorites in Bashan. Balak, the king of Moab, sent his elders to Balaam, the son of Beor, to persuade him to curse Israel. After initial hesitation, Balaam accepts the task. The Bible says that Yahweh's wrath was unleashed against Balaam and that a Malach was sent to him. When Balaam sent out with his donkey, the Malach of Yahweh stood in his way and frightened the animal so that it turned off the main road into a field. The style of this section is realistic and shows us that the angel actually behaves in a very concrete way. While Balaam is beating the donkey to get it to return to the path, the Malach is standing on the path between the vines, which is a small wall near the side. The donkey pushes aside to pass, but crushes Balaam's foot against the wall. The scene continues until the Malach tells Balaam that he must carry out the orders he will receive from him. In describing the scene, the Bible, Numbers 22:22, says, and placed himself, angel of Yahweh, in the path as adversary, or Satan, obstacle. In the next verse, the angel speaks in the first person and says, Numbers 22:32, I came out as Satan. This brief review of the verses confirms two fundamental aspects of the Satan. First, the Satan is neither a person nor an angel, not a specific subject endowed with a unique characteristic, feature, and will, acting out of his own individuality. Satan is not a proper name, but a specific function. It represents a position or a task to be assumed or executed by either man or malachim. Most importantly, the Satan is not an antagonist of God. In fact, it often acts in accordance with God and in agreement with his will. This is a crucial point. He precisely and faithfully does what God wants from him. Finally, as a result, the Satan cannot be unequivocally identified as a leader of rebellious ranks. Lucifer. Religious tradition has created a conflation and confusion between Satan and another angelic figure, Lucifer. The term Lucifer literally means bearer of light and derives from the Latin term Lucifer, composed of lux, light, and fere, to bring. The same term is often used to define the planet Venus, which appears at dawn, anticipating daylight. In popular lore, this term generally refers to a luminous being of an evil nature. It is often referred to as the leader of demons, the lord of the underworld, who would damn souls into afterlife. The characterization is based on Judeo-Christian tradition that provide a specific interpretation of a passage in the book of Isaiah in which Lucifer and Satan are equated and superimposed by commentators and theologians. In this verse, Lucifer is said to be the name born by the brightest of the angels before he was cast out of heaven. After he had rebelled against God, the light-bearer angel became, therefore, the adversary of God par excellence, named Satan. The leading proponent of this interpretation were Jerome, Tertullian, Origen, Saint Gregory the Great, Saint Cyprian of Carthage, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, and Saint Augustine of Canterbury. They all agreed that Lucifer / Satan and his angel / demon once lived as angels of God in their original state, a heavenly state from which they had fallen due to pride and rebellion. The fathers of the church established an identity between Isaiah's Lucifer and the Satan mentioned in the book of Job and the Gospel. This identity overlapped has then entered religious and popular tradition. Let us thus address the biblical passages that the fathers of the church and the theologians have used to identify and conjure together Satan and Lucifer, starting with Ezekiel 28. Ezekiel 28. In this chapter, Ezekiel addresses the king of Tyre and delivers a message from Yahweh to him. Ezekiel sharply rebukes the king for his pride and predicts his inevitable fall at the hands of the nations sent by Yahweh himself. His enemies will cause him to die a violent death and by sending him, according to traditional translations, to the underworld. However, the translation of the Hebrew term shakhat as underworld is a bit of a stretch. The term shakhat does not refer to the underworld, it refers to a pit, like the one to catch wild animals. The prophet threatens the arrival of foreign peoples who will fight against the king, defeat him, and bring him down to a pit. I'm going to bring foreigners against you, most ruthless of nations. They will draw their sword against your beauty and wisdom and pierce your shining splendor. They will bring you down to the pit, and you will die a violent death in the depths of the waters. Ezekiel 28, 7-8. The sequence also suggests that the descent into the pit occurs before the killing, so it could be a simple capture followed by death by drowning, believing in the depth of the water. The narrative continues with what the Bible expressly calls lamentation over the king of Tyre, Ezekiel 28:12. It is this section the king is compared to a cherub expelled from the Garden of Eden because of his pride. Pride also constitutes the reprehensible disposition of the king of Tyre, which moved him to desecrate sanctuaries, commit acts of violence, and thus burden himself with numerous sins that could no longer be redeemed. This passage is the one that was then interpreted as referring to Lucifer, for even though we will see there's nothing in that allows for this juxtaposition, let's focus on verse 14. You cherub expansion, opening of the covering, and I had placed you on mount of sacred Elohim, you were in middle of stones of fire walking. Like the cherub in Eden, the king of Tyre was in a privileged position, but malice, greed, and pride took possession of his heart. The punishment is inevitable. However, the punishment is his destruction and death, not his fall and banishment to the underworld. Verse 18 and 19 say that he will be turned into ashes, and then it goes on to say, and not you will he until forever, and not you will be he, and not you will be until forever. In other words, Ezekiel tells the king of Tyre, you will never exist again. Therefore, this figure cannot be traced back to Lucifer / Satan, because if we consider Satan a spiritual creature, he would still exist. But Ezekiel here says that he was turned into ashes. The juxtaposition between Ezekiel's character and Lucifer's alleged figure is unfounded and erroneous. Let us now look at Isaiah 14, the Lucifer of Isaiah. The actual passage from which the entire theological elaboration of Lucifer originated is the following: Isaiah 14:12-15. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn! You have been cast down to the earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens, I will raise my throne above the stars of El. I will sit enthroned on the top of the mount of the assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zephon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Elion. But you are brought down to the underworld, to the depths of the pit. Isaiah 14:12-15. The protagonist of this tirade considers himself so powerful that he becomes like the one above, i.e., the character named Elion, whom we discussed in chapter 9. But his arrogance is punished, and he is thrown into the underworld. Against this background, we can better understand how the Church Fathers proceeded in their argumentation, the end of which was the identification of Satan with Lucifer. The decisive step towards this designation was compared to the episode we have just read from Isaiah, the fall of the prince of the rebellious angels, with Luke 10:18, where Jesus asserts, I saw Satan fall from heaven. In their effort to find parallels between the Old and New Testament, the Church Fathers and the theologians believed the Isaiah and Luke were speaking of the same thing. In this way, they arrived at the identification Satan Lucifer is still popular today. However, they only juxtaposed two unrelated passages. No biblical passage explicitly allows this approach, quite the contrary. The real problem lies in identifying the protagonist of Isaiah's prophecy with Lucifer. This identification is possible only with a lot of imagination. Isaiah 14 is a sarcastic composition directed against someone, a king or a powerful man, who is said to have thought it possible to rise above the heights of Elion. For context, the prophets addressed the people of Israel, urging them to say Mashkael, proverb sentence parable, against an unidentified ruler with ironic expressions. He hurled at him that he was once a great one who terrified the nations, but now has become like the others. He once made the earth tremble, but now lies buried among other corpses. Who is this figure of whom Isaiah speaks? According to one tradition, this could be Nabonidus, the king of Babylon, who defeated by Cyrus the Great and allowed the Jews to return to Palestine in 538 before Common Era. However, it is much more likely that the verse refers to Xerxes, who ended the period of good coexistence between Achaemenid dynasty and the Jerusalem ruling class. The end of this idyllic relationship also had a negative impact on their rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, which suffered a setback. The verses of Isaiah 14:4-23 are, in fact, a summary of the parable of the Persian ruler and what happened under his reign, the end of the religious tolerance introduced by Cyrus the Great, the destruction of important inhabitant centers, including Babylon, the ruin of the Persian Empire, the defeat of the Salamists, Plataea, Mycale, and Masale, and the violent death of Xerxes. Moreover, the biblical passage directly responds to what the Persian king had written about himself when he asked the deity to be great and happy in the two lives, the earthly and the future. The biblical condemnation is also directed against the king who was guilty of ending the universalist policy of his predecessor Cyrus, whom the prophet himself had even called Yahweh's Messiah. Isaiah 45:1. Thus the prophet invites the Jewish people to come. Thus the prophet invites the Jewish people to mock the new ruler with irony and sarcasm. This prophecy was written after the king's death, and like all other biblical prophecies, which were always written after the occurrence of events, and therefore are prophecies post-eventum. There are many similarities between Isaiah's ranting and the events of Xerxes' reign. The time of the composition of the biblical text referred to as Deutero-Isaiah, and the events described in the decades of Israel's restoration after the Babylonian exile coincide as well. It is most likely that the unfortunate protagonist of Isaiah's prophecy in chapter 14 is the Achaemenid ruler Xerxes. These reasons clarify that the figure referred to by the prophet is not an evil spirit, a devil, or the leader of an infernal ranks. Isaiah's tirade is not directed at Lucifer, but at a powerful man, most likely an arachnimenid king, as said, possibly Xerxes. Nevertheless, the verse we quoted from Isaiah 14:12, "How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn," served the church fathers as the basis for all subsequent doctrinal understanding, actually misunderstanding Lucifer. From the passage, they constructed the non-existent figure of an angel called Lucifer after the morning star, the light bearer. However, as anyone can verify, Isaiah does not speak of any angel in this section, not once. Isaiah only mentions that someone has fallen from grace, compared to him, the morning star, the son of the dawn. The next step was short. Having identified Lucifer as the target of Isaiah's tirade, the church fathers also equated him with Satan by reading Luke 10:18. The patristic tradition found in culmination in St. Thomas Aquinas, who not only endorsed the identification of Lucifer with Satan, but also sought to document that it is precisely from such identification that the origin of the so-called Mysterium Iniquitatis can be grasped. This still unsolved mystery of the existence of evil and injustice in the world. Conclusion. In summary, a verse addressed to Xerxes was redirected to Lucifer. This is the result of a pure and inconsistent theological elaboration. We wonder, is the whole thing based on a bona fide misunderstanding, or an explicit desire to find a textual basis to define the figure of the Lord of the underworld where sinners would end up after death? Again, we leave this question open, but we hope to have shown that the biblical text is foreign to the traditional iconography that sees Satan, Lucifer, as Prince of the Demons, Adversary par excellence, and the Lord of the Underworld. These concepts are not presented in the Bible. As for the term Satan, we have seen that this word does not denote a specific person, but a function. It is a duty, a task that both men and Malachim can perform and accomplish. The Satan is not a spiritual being to be feared or approached to summon unknown evil forces. We have also documented that the Lucifer of Isaiah has nothing to do with the biblical Satan. Finally, if Satan does not exist, Satanism does not exist either. It is based on invented and false doctrines and finds its nefarious spiritual justification in unfounded doctrines. So there you go. We have an explanation of Satan there. And I'm going to give you a second source, going to the scholar Dan McClellan. The Bible says Satan is God's enemy. Finding the devil in the details. The Hebrew noun Satan occurs 27 times in the Hebrew Bible. It fundamentally refers to someone who is an enemy or an adversary with someone else, and most of the authors who use the word use it to refer to humans opposing one another. For instance, in 1 Samuel 29:4, the commanders of the Philistines are suspicious of David and don't want him to going into battle with them. So they say, he will not go down with us to battle, so that he does not become a Satan to us in the battle. The word can also be used to refer to divine agents, as when the angel of Yahweh confronts Balaam. Numbers 22:22 says the angel took a stand on the road as a Satan. There's also a particular occurrence of this noun in 1 Corinthians 21:1, where the text states that either a Satan or Satan opposed Israel and incited David to count Israel. I lean in the direction of the indefinite use a Satan, but Esther Hamori's phenomenal book, God's Monsters, has a great discussion that favors understanding it as the personal name Satan in this verse. In this verse, to count Israel means to find out how many men of fighting age are available for battle. The author seems to think that this is a bad move because it means David did not have enough faith to rely on God to fight Israel's battles. The really peculiar part is the parallel story in 2 Samuel 24:1 says that it was Yahweh who was angry at Israel and incited David against them. Scholars have accounted for this difference in a variety of ways, but what seems most likely to me is that the editors of Chronicles wanted to avoid making Yahweh the inciter of something bad, and so outsourced the incitement to an unnamed Satan. If the chronicler intended to use the word as the proper name Satan, it's the only such occurrence in all of the Hebrew Bible. 17 of the 27 occurrences of the noun Satan, 15 in Job and 2 in Zechariah, often occur with and Zechariah occur with the definite article meaning they refer to the Satan. In both of the books, Satan is some kind of divine figure, and so the word is no longer being used to refer to a human occupying a temporary role as an opponent or an adversary. The Satan is still a role, but now it seems to be a kind of divine office or assignment with the divine council, the pantheon's administrative hierarchy. It's not a name as so much as a responsibility within the heavenly bureaucracy. This is most clear in Job 1 and 2, where the Satan presents himself before God with the other gods called the children of God and challenges Job's faithfulness. The book of Job is contemplating the problem of evil and why bad things must happen to good people, why bad things happen to good people. But the majority of the chapters are poetry likely composed separately from the narrative of the Satan wager with God. The narrative framework in chapters 1, 2, 13, and 42, 7 through 17 was probably added later to provide an introduction and a resolution that paints Job's suffering as the product of the machinations of an antagonizing divine agent and a rather aloof God. Zechariah 3 tells a very brief story of the high priest Joshua standing before the angel of Yahweh and the Satan who stood to his right to act as accuser or adversary. The text then says Yahweh rebuked the Satan and moved Joshua's sins. It's literature from Hellenistic Judaism that begins to develop stations and names for angelic hierarchies, as well as a concept of malevolent divine forces. The main point of this development seems to be to account for the presence of evil in the world. Passages like Isaiah 45:7 seem to attribute the good and the bad directly to God, but this didn't sit well with a lot of folks in the ancient world. A lot of scholars think that early Jewish debate about the origins of evil was likely influenced by Zoroastrian dualism and the figure of Angra Mainyu, a spirit of death and destruction who opposed the righteous Penta Mainyu and sought to tempt humanity. We don't have a lot of data from the Persian period to help reconstruct what happened. Reconstruct how this happened, though. Most of the development takes place within a text from the Hellenistic period, like First Enoch and Jubilees, which elaborate on the story from Genesis 6 that the sons of God having children with human women, see chapter 14, and on the reception of the law within the book of Exodus. In First Enoch's various retellings, these sons of God are represented as a cohort of rebellious angels who descended to earth under the leadership of a head angel referred to alternatively as Azazel, and Shemiyaza. Giants are born to these sons of God, and they then reproduce to create the Nephilim. The word Satan occurs the 4 times in the First Enoch. The plural Satan occurs in First Enoch 47 and 65:6, which seem to use the term to designate a specific malevolent class of angels. The singular Satan occurs as a title in First Enoch 53:3 and 54:6, and the later passage seems to be using the title to refer to Azazel. There's less variation in Jubilees, which follows after the narrative of Enoch and refers to the leader of the spirits of First Enoch's dead giants as Mastema. This name derives from the root Satam, which is a variation on Satan. Another title for some kind of malevolent entity is Belial, which is based on a Hebrew word meaning uselessness or wickedness. There's a reference to the Satan in Jubilees 10:11, but the other uses of the word occur in the phrases "no Satan or any evil one," which seems to understand it as a type of malevolent spirit, an adversarial human, or perhaps both. The word Satan occurs a few times in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but not as a title or name. The titles and names used to refer to the head malevolent angel in the scrolls are Melchiresha, king of wickedness, a twist on Melchizedek, king of righteousness, angel of darkness, Mastema, and most commonly Belial. Like the word Satan, Belial can be used as a title for a specific malevolent agent, but also as a reference to a type or a class of malevolent spirit. It also occurs in Greek as Beliar, and in pseudepigraphic Jewish texts written around the time period as the Scrolls. So we don't have an individual named Satan anywhere in the Jewish literature that preceded the New Testament. In fact, the leader of the forces of evil in that literature is more commonly identified with the titles other than Satan. Today we think of the word Satan more as a name than as a title or a generic noun. We don't usually talk about the Satan or about plural Satans, but there's a related word that we do use that way that can help us better understand how the Hebrew word Satan functioned anciently before it turned into the personal name of the devil. It's precisely the word devil. The English word comes from the Greek diabolos, which means slanderer, and comes from the verb diabolo, which means to bring charges against someone or to accuse them, either justly or falsely. Diabolos occurs in a variety of ancient Greek texts to refer to human and divine adversaries, and was one of the main words chosen by the ancient Greek translators of the Hebrew Bible to render the Hebrew word Satan. The way we use the word devil today, as a title, the devil, and as a generic noun, a devil, devils, is precisely how the word Satan seems to have been overwhelmingly used before the New Testament moved in the direction of a personal name. Everything is the devil to you, mama. The Hebrew word Satan is transliterated into Greek for the New Testament as Satanas, where it occurs 36 times and is used either as a title or a personal name. It is frequently used in conjunction with the Hodiabolos, the devil, which is more clearly used as a title. This follows in the tradition of the Septuagint, which uses the Greek Hodiabolos to translate the Hebrew Hasatan, the Satan, in places like Job 1:6 and 2:1. The New Testament is clearly elaborating on the Enochic tradition by representing the Satan figure as the head of a group of malevolent angels who will all face God's judgment for introducing wickedness to humanity. For example, in Matthew 25:41, Jesus warns that when the Son of Man returns, the unrighteous will be consigned to everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. See chapter 19. The precursor to this imagery is the tradition developed within the Enochian literature. Satan also becomes the primary tempter and accuser of humans in the New Testament. Oddly, the other titles that were used in earlier Jewish literature to refer to this lead angel don't really appear in the New Testament, or if they do, only very rarely. Beliar, for instance, occurs only once in 2 Corinthians 6:15, while the names and titles Mastema, Shemihaza, and Yazazel, and Azael, Mechilirisha, an angel of darkness don't occur anywhere in the text that would become the New Testament. Satan's divine profile did, however, have other names and titles added to it in the New Testament, added to it as the New Testament began a long process of conflating various malevolent divine figures from the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Judaism together into this single figure who would become known primarily as Satan or the devil. For instance, in Matthew 12:24, the Pharisees accused Jesus of casting out devils by Beelzebul, the prince of the devils. In other words, they were accusing Jesus of having been given his authority over demons by their own leader, Beelzebul. In the next verse, Jesus responds by saying Satan can't cast out Satan. So it doesn't make sense that the Son of Man would be able to cast out devils by Beelzebul. Here, the author seems to be identifying Beelzebul as Satan, or at least the head of a Satan's angelic forces. Now, you may not be used to seeing that name Beelzebul spelled that way. Maybe Beelzebub is more familiar to you. But the Greek very clearly has Beelzebul. A lot of translations change it to Beelzebub because that's closer to the name Baalzebub, which is how a King James renders the title in 2 Kings 1, 2, 3, 6, and 16. Beelzebub means Lord of Flies, which is pretty metal, but is not the actual title that was used to refer to Paul. whose name just means Lord or Master. The Northwest Semitic storm god Baal was sometimes referred to as Zebul Baal or Prince Lord. But the biblical authors, like they so often did, changed it to make fun of the storm god. Baalzebub is a fake name used to mock Baal. The New Testament authors preserve the more accurate title. Another identification of Satan with a figure from the Hebrew Bible has also caused a lot of confusion. In Revelation 12:9 and 22, Satan is referred to as the devil and as well as a dragon and that ancient serpent. Now, most people immediately think of the serpent from the Garden of Eden, but that's not who these verses were talking about. There's only one divine agent anywhere in the Bible that is referred to both as a serpent and a dragon. That's Leviathan, the primordial chaos monster of early Israelite myth. The author of Revelation would have been reading the Septuagint, which translated the Hebrew name Leviathan into Greek as Drakon, or dragon. Isaiah 27:1 explains that Yahweh will punish and kill Leviathan, who is also referred to in the verse as Ophis, serpent, and the Drakon, dragon, the same two Greek words used to refer to Satan in Revelation 12 and 20. Revelation 12:3 also says that this great red dragon has 7 heads. This is usually thought to refer to the 7 hills of Rome, but there are additional resonances with the figure of Leviathan. Part of the lament in Psalm 74 praises Yahweh for salvific as well as creative acts. Verse 14 says Yahweh was king from old and crushed the heads of Leviathan. This seems to be part of what made the creation of the earth possible, and it indicates Leviathan was even more ancient a serpent than the one from Eden. Now, this doesn't say how many heads Leviathan had, but there's another text from centuries before the Bible was written that indicates Leviathan was thought to have precisely 7 heads. In the Hebrew Bible, Isaiah 27:1 says, Yahweh will punish Leviathan, the wriggling serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the monster which is in the sea. This isn't Isaiah's work, though. Isaiah is quoting a tradition from centuries earlier, and we have another version of that tradition from around 500 years earlier. In Ugaritic Baal cycle, a deity named Mot, death, refers to Baal's defeat of a serpent named Litan, Ugaritic version of the Hebrew Leviathan. Mott says, you struck down Latan, and wriggling serpent finished off the twisting serpent, the powerful one with 7 heads. It seems likely the author of Revelation is aware that at least part of this tradition of a 7-headed dragon from the sea. Leviathan makes far better sense of the imagery that the author of Revelation is linking with Satan. Additionally, by the time Revelation was written, it's unlikely anyone had identified the serpent from the Garden of Eden as Satan. There are only 2 texts that have a plausible case for linking the 2 figures prior to the close for the New Testament. The first is the apocryphal Wisdom of Solomon, probably written in the 1st century before Common Era. Chapter 2, verse 24 says, but by the envy of a diabolos, death entered the world. I would say most scholars think that this probably refers to the serpent in the garden. But even that would only identify the serpent as Diabolos, not necessarily Satan. But this also strikes me as a forced reading. The Wisdom of Solomon never refers to any kind of malevolent divine force, and death is represented as a product of human wickedness that is alien to God's creation. 1:14-16. I think this argument is stronger than the indefinite Diabolos adversary who brings death into the world is probably to be interpreted as Cain, who envied Abel and killed him as a result, the first death within God's creation. The other passage that could plausibly identify Satan as the serpent from Garden of Eden is Romans 16:20, which says, and the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. This is understood by some interpreters to be referring to the serpent's curse in Genesis 3:15, when God says, I will put enmity between you and between the woman, and between your offspring, and between her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. In my opinion, there are 2 problems with this reading. The first is that the notion of God placing the wicked under the feet of the righteous is pretty stock imagery that is known from other Jewish and Greco-Roman literature and iconography. For instance, the depiction of Aphrodite in the North Frisia Pergamon altar depicts her with her left foot on the face of a giant as she's killing. David praises Yahweh in 2 Samuel 22:39 because, thanks to him, his enemies fell under my feet. The pseudepigraphic Testament of Levi 18:12 promises that God will give his children power to trample upon the wicked spirits. The imagery in Romans 16 doesn't remotely have to be alluding to Genesis 3:15. The other problem is that Paul would have been relying on the Septuagint's version of Genesis, which doesn't actually refer to anyone striking or crushing the head of the serpent's offspring. The ancient Greek translation renders the passage with a verb that means the offspring of the woman will watch out for or keep an eye on the head of the serpent's offspring, while that offspring would do the same at the heel for the heel of the woman's offspring. The serpent from the Garden of Eden is not the only figure who would become firmly identified with Satan after the completion of the New Testament. Isaiah 14:4 directly directs Isaiah to take up a taunt against the king of Babylon. In verse 12, the prophet sarcastically refers to this king as Hillel ben Shahar, or Shining One, son of the dawn, and insists he has fallen from heaven after arrogantly aspiring to raise his throne above the stars of God. The Septuagint would later translate the Hebrew Hillel into Greek as Hesephoros, or Dawnbringer. This was the name of a god in the Greek pantheon who was identified with the planet Venus, the morning star. When Jerome produced the Vulgate, a fresh translation of the Bible into Latin, around 400 Common Era, he borrowed the name of the Roman god associated with Venus and translated Hesperos as Lucifer, or light bringer. The title Lucifer was never intended as a reference to Satan. The Hebrew title Shining One is never mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, but Jerome did use the title Lucifer to translate the Greek word phosphorus, another reference to Venus as the light bringer, in 2 Peter 1:19. The passage talks about this morning star, as it's usually translated, rising in the heart of believers, which is thought by many scholars to be alluding to Jesus. This is certainly the case in Revelation 22:16, where different Greek words are used to identify Jesus as the bright and morning star. As you can see, it complicates things to identify the shining one of Isaiah 14:12 as Satan. It doesn't seem to me that any biblical authors links Satan with Isaiah 14:12, but some folks argue that Luke 10:18 makes precisely that link. In that passage, Jesus declares, "I saw Satan falling like lightning from heaven." This is argued to allude to the falling of the shining one from heaven. But this isn't the only divine agent who falls from heaven within earlier Jewish tradition. I and other scholars suggest a more likely source would be the fall from heaven of the head of the malevolent angels within the Enochian tradition, precisely the divine agent who would provide the conceptual framework for the figure of Satan. In 1 Enoch 86:1, Enoch says, I saw the heaven above, and look, and a star fell from heaven. Later in verse 3, he says, I looked to heaven, and look, I saw many stars descended and cast themselves down from heaven to that first star. These are the head angels' minions. In Revelation 12, the dragon's tail sweeps a third of the stars of heaven down to the earth. This far more influential tradition strikes me as a much more likely source for Jesus' statement. Conclusion. The identification of a malevolent divine agent named Satan who stands opposed to God and to his followers is an innovation that is unique to the New Testament. But the divine profile of Satan that we know today has been significantly expanded and elaborated on since the completion of the New Testament, and particularly with the identification of the serpent from the Garden of Eden and the shining one from Isaiah 14:12 as Satan. The Hebrew Bible knows no entity named Satan, but it does use the word Satan to refer to humans and divine agents who operate as opponents and adversaries. That word later became used as a title for a specific role or office within the divine council, as we see in Job and in Zechariah. The Enochian and other Hellenistic Jewish literature would further develop both senses of the word. The plural satans was used to refer to some kind of class of malevolent divine entity, and then Satan became a title for the head malevolent angel, who was known by a variety of different names. The New Testament seems to consolidate these and other figures from the Hebrew and other Jewish literature into the figure of Satan, who also became known as the devil. This is finally God's enemy who fights against him and his followers, accuses humanity, and tempts them with wickedness. But this figure is a literary creation of the first century Common Era. So if you've been following along, you should be understanding that there's clearly a divide between the reality of the texts, the context, and the history surrounding, and what people believe about the Bible in reality. Well, there's clearly more than one deity in these books. There's no Satan, at least very much no real boogeyman at all of that nature until really developing into the New Testament era. The messengers of God, the angelic hierarchies in tradition. In many biblical stories, there are intermediary figures called Malachim, who act and speak on behalf of the Elohim and generally interact with the people of Israel in various capacities. Theological tradition calls these Malachim angels and attributes to them, as well as we shall see in this chapter, a whole set of complicated spiritual characteristics. Angelology is the discipline that studies the transcendental and metaphysical nature of these beings. However, are the spiritual and transcendental features attributed to the Malachim by angelology, religious piety, theologians, and traditional exegesis grounded in the Bible? Literal analysis of Genesis, Exodus, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Tobiah, and Zechariah has led us to conclude that these so-called angels clearly behave like individuals of flesh and blood. The Malachim walk, get dusty, get tired, get upset, need to wash and rest, eat twice in the same day, decide where to spend the night, and protect themselves from attacks with methods that are worthy of our scrutiny. Their physical difference is noticeable. They are endowed with powers superior to those of humans, but they are not omnipotent. They show vulnerability, can be attacked, and are subject to the regular physiological needs of human beings. We we will show how the Malachim can often instill fear in those who encounter them, and their presence is hardly ever reassuring. Many of those who meet them fear they may not survive. It will soon be clear that the ethereal, positive, and reassuring angelic figures that religious tradition devised still present today in popular piety have no grounds in the Bible. The biblical accounts are also far from later theological elaborations that have divided the angels into complicated angelic hierarchies, describing them as mediating entities between human carnality and divine spirituality. For the sake of clarity, we would like to preface that our goal is not to provide the existence of angels, beings, or otherwise. We just want to verify their presence and description in the Old Testament and compare our findings with the religious and spiritual traditions in general. Angelology speaks of various rankings of angels, distinguished according to the functions performed. Each received from God unique spiritual gifts such as light, science, or goodness. Their task is transmitting these spiritual gifts down to humans. Together, these figures form 9 angelic choirs, divided into 3 orders. Each order is, in turn, divided into ranks. The highest order is composed of seraphim, cherubim, and thrones. The second order is composed of dominations, virtues, and powers. The third and lowest order is composed of principalities, archangels, and angels. Each group possesses specific characteristics, which we do not enumerate here, except those that interest us related to the orders of the angels and cherubim, and as they are the object of our analysis. Among the qualities attributed to the angels, it is said, for example, that they are the way to the Word, the perfect vessel of divine light. They convey the power of God in converting sinners. They impart wisdom into the revelation of the divine mysteries. They correspond justice in the condemnation of the wicked. They are an example of worthy imitation in avoiding punishment, overcoming vices, being admitted to heaven, etc. Given these descriptions, we make a first and immediate observation. We are dealing here with beings whose physical and the behavioral characteristics are far less elevating and inspiring than those we have mentioned as apropos of angels and the other angelic orders. Therefore, is everything written about an angel theology justified by the description of the Malachim as found in the Old Testament? Are we sure that the theological vision is consistent with the evidence described in the Bible? The Malachim in the Old Testament. We now present some situations in which the angels Malachim are involved, and leave it to the readers to make their own reflections. Genesis 16. The patriarch Avram and his bride Sarai have no children, despite Yahweh's promise that they will have as many children as there are grains of sand. As time passes without Sarai being able to conceive, disappointed by the passing of time, Sarai decides to give the Egyptian maid Hagar to her husband Abram. Hagar gets pregnant, becomes arrogant, and takes advantage of her new status until Sarai drives her out of the camp with Abram's permission. The slave girl leaves the camp and wanders into the desert where she meets Amalek. Genesis 16:7. And found a messenger of Yahweh on Ai spring water, the waters in the desert, on the Ai spring water of in the road of Shur. The encounter with the messenger of Yahweh seems casual, as the angel Malak himself looks surprised. However, he shows that he knows Hagar personally, since he asks her, Hagar, of slaves of Sarai, where from this you come and where you will go. So this messenger knows Hagar, but does not know where she is going or why she is there. As far as he knows, she is supposed to be in Abram's camp, and so he orders her to return there and serve her mistress. He does not fail, however, he reassures her. He does not fail, however, to reassure her. The son she gives birth to will be the progenitor of a great people. From Ishmael descends the group of peoples commonly called nomadic Arabs. The narrative has its epilogue in chapter 21, in which Yahweh makes another decision. Sarai, with the help of God, finally conceives and gives birth to Isaac. Yahweh chooses him to be the true heir and progenitor of the new descendants who will populate the so-called Promised Land. This choice has precise consequences. There cannot be two heirs. Conflict and separation must be avoided. Power and control over property must not be shared. Thus, after the birth of the rightful heir, Hagar must leave the camp forever, but, as we have said, Ishmael will be still the progenitor of a great nation. Undoubtedly, every person born from Abraham's lineage must have had an important place in the strategic design of the Elohim who ruled over that part of the Middle East. Over time, Yahweh had to build up a group of people with whom to occupy and rule the territories that had been assigned to him at the time of the division made by Elion. His messenger acted according to the precise strategic plan. In the story of Hagar, it must be noted, we faced with a concrete situation, no visions or dreams. When Hagar encounters the Malak, we are confronted with an unanticipated and undoubtedly real and concrete event. The messenger does not fly, and he does not show himself in a vision. He meets the woman in a specific place, addresses her personally, and asks her a question from which it is clear that he was not informed about what was happening. It is an ordinary meeting and dialogue between two real people / individuals. Genesis 22. In Genesis 22, Yahweh demands a particularly burdensome and cruel test of loyalty to Abraham. He forces him to sacrifice his own son Isaac. Abraham agrees. He prepares everything necessary for a sacrifice, sets off for the hill indicated to him. And on the way, however, the son is astonished to discover that an essential element is missing: the sacrificial victim. The father cannot reveal to the son that the intended sacrifice is Isaac himself, and reassures him by saying that Yahweh will provide the victim for the sacrifice. Once they reach their destination, Abraham builds the altar, puts wood on it, binds Isaac, and puts him on the pile. He grabs his knife, and just when he's about to kill his own son Isaac, Genesis 22, and he called towards him, messenger of Yahweh, from the sky, and said, Abraham, Abraham. Amalek calls Abraham from the sky and orders him to stop. He does not need to perform the sacrifice. The loyalty test is passed, and the Elohim now knows he can count on an ally so faithful to be willing to sacrifice his son's life. The sacrifice continues at the expense of a goat caught on the spot. In this sequence of events, there is precise distinction between two figures: the Elohim who tests Abraham in verse 1, and the Malach who comes to him from above to interrupt the sacrifice. The whole scene of dialogue with the call response is highly effective in its simplicity. The Malach calls Abraham, Abraham twice. He responds, Hinene, here I am, I'm here. The conversation continues and ends with renewed promises for the future of Abraham and his descendants. Let us note that allegedly omniscient God does not know Abraham's disposition towards him in advance, and therefore has to test him with a concrete, cruel, and inhumane request. Only after he makes sure that Abraham obeys him perfectly does God send a Malach, a messenger, to interrupt the sacrifice. Had the Elohim been able to read Abraham's mind, this passage would prove to be a string of meaningless actions. But God did not know Abraham's thoughts, so he had to put him to the test. He is no different from ordinary earthly rulers, and as ordinary earthly rulers often prefer to bring in intermediaries, so does he. The narrative thus presents us with an Elohim who cannot grasp a person's state of mind and employs an Elohim to interrupt an ongoing action. As anyone can verify by reading this biblical story, any spiritual connotation is absent from both the premise and the sequence of the events. Genesis 28. We encourage our reader to consult directly the biblical passage in which Jacob describes seeing a ladder connecting earth and the heaven, with angels ascending and descending it. This scene is often read in ufological perspective. We fundamentally agree with this interpretation, but want to respect the biblical text, which implicitly states that Jacob was asleep. It was all a dream. Since it is not our task to interpret dreams, we withhold judgment on the scene. The reader, however, will do well to inform his own opinion by consulting any version of the Bible directly. Genesis 32. In the previous sections, we witnessed accusations that could be described as typical of the Malachim. They acted as mediators, spokesmen, and executors of orders. Now we will see a situation in which the Malachim are present but do nothing. It is precisely their inaction that makes the situation interesting. This incident is so insignificant that it is always forgotten by commentators interested in the extraordinary. Experience teaches us, however, that indirect clues of great significance are often hidden in the folds of the ordinary. Jacob has traveled to the land of his fathers to choose a bride. After a series of tribulations, he acquires more than one and returns to the home of his father Isaac. During his journey, an incident occurs that has nothing to do with the journey itself and has no apparent consequences. The inclusion of this passage in the Bible is not justified in the grand scheme of Jacob's journey and narrative, but is precisely this fact that makes it interesting for our purposes. Jacob was in the middle of his journey, and stumble upon him messengers of Elohim, camp of Elohim this. As a result of this meeting, he decides to call that place Machanaim, a term that is always translated as if it were a proper name. In reality, Machanaim is the dual form of Machane, which means camp. Therefore, Machanaim means two camps. This is particularly vivid in the realistic scene. The angel do nothing. They mind their own business. Jacob arrives with his people and his cattle. The Malachim approach him without speaking. He recognizes them as messengers of the Elohim and realizes that he has come near two of their quarters and therefore decides to identify this place as a Machanaim. The root of the verb pakam, to come across, contains within itself the concept of chance fate, and thus the narrative tells us with a clarity that requires no interpretation that the encounters happened by chance. None of the actors, neither Jacob nor the Malachim, expected it. The presence of the Malachim, Jacob's realization that he found by chance two camps of the Elohim, and the particular construction of the name that Jacob decided to give the place, Machanaim, two camps, confirms the reading of the Hebrew exegete Rashi Troyes, who openly speaks of two camps of armies defending the two sides of a territorial border. Perhaps it is not by chance that some members of the troop, the Malachim, moved to meet the stranger who was coming closer. Their mere presence induced Jacob and his people not to approach any further and resume their journey home in a different direction. Nothing else happens. The angels do not fly in. There are no messages and no actions are performed. No orders are given or executed, and there are no visions or dreams. The Bible simply reports a visual encounter. Some Malachim approach Jacob without direct contact. Immediately afterward, everyone continues with what he was doing before the encounter. Anyone who has seen civilians approaching a military camp out of sheer curiosity knows that the guards would immediately intervene to deny them entry. In many cases, the mere sight of the guards is enough to make it clear that no one is allowed to come close. The same happens with Jacob. If we find the story in the Bible, it is because Jacob was impressed by it. The sight of an Elohim camp must not have been an ordinary event, and so the patriarch fondly recalled the experience. The Malachim did nothing and said nothing to him, but the double camp remained firmly in his memory and in the biblical text. Exodus 23. Of particular importance is the context of Exodus 23:20-30, which sets forth the strategy that Yahweh intends to employ in conquering the promised land for Moses and his people. An essential component of this strategy entails the presence of a messenger, whom Yahweh will send before Moses and the people to supervise them and give them the necessary instructions. The Malak will always go before them, and they are to provide him with absolute obedience. Exodus 23:21. Not talents will he your transgressions for. God explains that this messenger will help them in the conquest, which is to be gradual. The people to be encouraged must not be driven out too quickly, for the abandoned land would become a desert and be occupied by wild animals. The conquest of the land will therefore be gradual, done at a time that will allow for gradual settlement and the necessary cultivation of the land for food production. We are therefore dealing with a God who must necessarily adjust to the times of nature and for the unforeseen needs of a mass of people crossing new lands. He does not perform those extraordinary deeds that would be expected of him to solve, with the help of his divine power, the problems that arise in such a situation. In verse 27, Yahweh specifies that he will send before the people his terror, but it is not known whether this term is to be attributed to the messenger or represents an additional instrument or tool. What is certain is that this terror will produce havoc on his adversaries, who will end up being captured. In any case, Yahweh acts like an ordinary human strategist who sends a deputy to command the troops based on specific and intelligent tactics that include logical aspects that cannot be neglected. The entire narrative is thus characterized by a healthy realism in which the alleged divine omnipotence and angelic spirituality seems to have no place. The Malak messenger and the Emma terror will be operational tools in the coming war. 1 Chronicles 21. In this book, we learn that King David orders a census and does so against Yahweh's will. 1 Chronicles 21:1. We will analyze that part of the story in which a messenger is sent to destroy the inhabitants of Jerusalem because of the ruler's decision. David turns to Yahweh and reminds him that he alone is responsible for the decision, and asks him not to kill people who are not to blame. This strange fact, God did not immediately realize that David alone was responsible for the census. Fortunately for the city, Yahweh changes his mind and orders his envoys not to carry on with the planned destruction. David then lifts his eyes and sees the Malak and the messengers, 1 Chronicles 21:16, standing between the earth and between the skies. David sees the Malak holding in his hand an object called a kerev, which is usually translated as sword, but whose root carries the meaning of to burn, to ruin, to bring to ruin. Clark. We do not know what it is, but the Bible tells us that this weapon is Nituya, pointed towards the city of Jerusalem, thus ready to strike and destroy. The biblical passage indicates that the messenger was near the threshing floor of Araunah, the Jezebite. We are presented here with a picture of everyday life that has nothing to do with visions or dream experiences. Araunah is threshing wheat with his sons, turns around and sees the Malak. His son sees him too. They are horrified by what they see and immediately hide. 1 Corinthians 21:15-20. There's nothing like this in dynamic description, which testifies that the appearance and posture of this figure must have been decidedly threatening. The burning and destructive weapon pointed at Jerusalem causes horror. Yahweh's messenger abandons his plan and orders a certain Gad to tell David to go up and build an altar on the threshing floor of Harunah. David obeys, preparing everything, and then calls upon Yahweh, who appears immediately. 1 Chronicles 21:26. And he responded in the fire from the skies on altar of the Holocaust. Those present see the messenger places his weapon in its sheath. The episode then ends with a further thought-provoking note. The danger is over, but in the days that follow, David does not dare to seek out Yahweh in his dwelling place, which was then on the heights of Gibeon. We have discussed Yahweh's connections with the mountains in chapter 8. Since he was terrified in face of sword or weapon of messenger of Yahweh. To see the weapon of the Malak must have been a fearsome and terrifying sight, unheard of, never seen before. Judges 6. In the period between the death of Joshua and the establishment of the monarchy, the nation of Israel was ruled from time to time by military and civil leaders, commonly called judges. They intervene in certain circumstances to deliver this or that tribe from certain enemies or oppression by neighboring peoples. One of these judges was called Gideon. The responsibility for his appointment is entrusted to a Malak who acted in a very special way. Gideon is threshing wheat when the Malak of Yahweh comes, stops under the oak tree of Ophrah, greets him, and announces that it has been decided to entrust him with the task of delivering Israel from the hands of the Midianites. Gideon declares he is unprepared and unworthy, but is reassured by the promises that Yahweh will support him directly. Still dazed, Gideon asks the Malak not to leave because he wants to return home to get food for him. The Malak promises to wait. Let us stop here for a moment and ask two simple questions. Who would think of offering food to a spiritual vision angel? Who would think of asking a spiritual vision, an angel, to have a little patience while one is busy with finding food, preparing it, and turning to the meeting places? Gideon thus returns home, prepares kid skin, meat, and bread, reaches the Malak who has been waiting for him all this time and offers him food. Then something decidedly out of the ordinary occurs. The Malak tells Gideon to put the meat and bread on a stone and asks him to pour the broth on it, and then Judges 6:21. And stretched messenger of Yahweh end of the stick that in his hand, and raised the fire from the rock, and touched in on the meat and in on the bread. The Malak burns the meat and the bread and then leaves. We consider it very difficult to interpret this story in a way that would not respect its realistic spontaneity and concreteness. To add any spiritual connotation to such a realistic story, or to superimpose it, would be to disregard the text. The Malak is undoubtedly using something that ignites flames, a striking correspondence with what we will read soon in the chapter dedicated to Elijah's miracle. Ezekiel 8. There's a passage in the Bible where the desire for religious people to see an angelic presence at any cost drives commentators to translate something that is not even present in the text. In Ezekiel 8, 1-3, the prophet describes an encounter with an undefined something that today's translations renders as follows. Behold, I saw a figure of human form. From the hips downward, it was on fire. From the hips upward, it shone like electrum. It seemed to me that he stretched out an arm and grabbed me by the hair. And the spirit lifted me up between heaven and earth. According to the traditional translations, an anthropomorphic angel figure here performs the strange and incomprehensible gesture of reaching out an arm and grabbing Ezekiel by the hair to lift him up. What a strange behavior for an angel. But if this story sounds strange, it is only because the translation is incorrect. The Masoretic text actually reads Ezekiel 8:2. And there resemblance like appearance of man, 2 hips its, and from its 2 hips and towards high, like appearance of shine, like eye of amber electrum. First, it should be noted that no human figure is mentioned. Something like the appearance of man comes along and radiates a kind of energy like fire from the lower part while it glows metallically in the higher part. Now let us continue with the alleged gesture of grabbing the hair. And he reached model of hand and took me by with gusset of head my and raised me ruach. The term zit, which is usually translated as hair, denotes in fact a gusset, a fastener of a garment, or even a clasp. As for the term ruach, we refer to what we said in the chapter dedicated to it. We recall here that this term probably identified something that flew swiftly through the air and strikes without obvious being a regular bird. The biblical text, therefore, literally tells us that Ezekiel sees a flaming, shining something. This intermediate something, in turn, generates or extends a something that could be described as an object or system a system capable of lifting a human being. It is evident that the most immediate way to refer to a grasping tool that is otherwise not easy to describe is to compare it to the human hand. Hand model, says the prophet. The whole Ruach raises the prophet and takes him away. We would have to use our imagination to find an image that corresponds to the description. But this image is currently not of the anthropomorphic angel. In the series of events that ensue, Ezekiel is led to Jerusalem, where he sees and exclaims, "There is Kavod of Yahweh." Book of Daniel. The Book of Daniel belongs to the so-called apocalyptic literature and was probably written around the 2nd century before Common Era. It is written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek and describes events from the Babylonian exile of 590 before Common Era. The general historical context in which the events are set is broad, very broad, from about 600 to 160 before Common Era. The text contains several anomalies in location, content, and language, so that it is not counted among the prophet's books of the prophetic books in the Hebrew biblical canon, but only among the writings. The considerable differences in structure and form, as well as in literary composition, shows that the book is a result of compilation and revision of pre-existing parts. In the various editions, there are differences in content, which as chapters present in the Greek Bible but absent in Hebrew, and so on. We know that apocalyptic literature, unlike a historical literature, uses specific categories such as visions and symbolism, which are not suited for a realistic depiction of reality. None of this prevents this book from being considered revealed in the Catholic canon and from being used to define angelic figures such as truths of faith. Despite all its ambiguities, this book is serenely used as a source for defining absolute truths and widely utilized in various elaborations in traditional angelology. Therefore, it should not be surprising that we also use this book in context to formulate hypotheses inserted into our independent research path. All the more so since in a text of dreams and visions would increase the credibility of the fact we are investigating. We less expect to find them, so they stand out. The book's protagonist is Daniel, a Jew who, through so-called visions, conveys the hope of a future in which a Messiah will come to bring a final deliverance to the people. It's a kind of theological world history in which the certainty is conveyed that God will fulfill his plans. Daniel 4. Nebuchadnezzar presents Daniel with a vision for interpretation. Surprisingly, a term appears in it that recalls the presence of well-defined individuals in Sumerian narratives, the Watchers. The texts say that Watchers and holy from the skies descend. This being announces a series of provisions stating that Daniel 4:14, by decree of Watchers, the decision. So there are a number of individuals who belong to this category of Watchers who determine the division of the kingdoms on the earth. The decision is announced by the Watchers. The holy ones declare the verdict. So the living man knows the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on the earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. Daniel 4:14. There is no reason to call them angels, nor can they be considered as such, as far as the characteristics that tradition attributes to them are concerned. Let us remember that the Sumerians called their country Kangir, i.e. the land of the Watchers, and that the Egyptians knew the Nithru, aka the Watchers, from the ancient times. These are not mere coincidences and should not be underestimated. The narratives of various peoples tell of individuals who formed power groups and were entrusted with certain tasks, including the distribution of governments on earth, to ensure the observance of laws, as is in the biblical text we are about to read. Greek philosopher Celsus, 2nd century before Common Era, recalls that the early Christians claimed that many of these guardians had already descended to earth by the dozens. We do not know for sure whether the vigilant watchers of whom we have spoken is the same individual who appears in Daniel 9:21, referred to as Gabriel. Daniel says that while he was praying during the evening sacrifice, this Gabriel presented himself to him, approached him, and spoke, saying that he had come to reveal everything to him. Daniel 9:20-22. It is not our purpose here to analyze the content of the messenger's numerous revelations to Daniel, for we must deal exclusively with his figure, especially by addressing a curious element that appears in the description of his manner of presentation. First, it should be noted that the term Gabriel is usually considered a proper noun, but it should not be overlooked that it primarily denotes a status, a position, insofar as it means strong man of El. The Hebrew root denotes the status of someone who possesses great power. We might think of him as a high-ranking commander or a diplomatic representative. His hypothetical membership in the upper echelons of a hierarchy could be justified by the fact that he is already a special person by birth. In this context, let us take a detail from the chapter on the Nephilim. Genesis 6:4 reports the connection between the sons of Elohim and the daughters of the Atom, who and had birthed to them the strong. Here it is said that the children of these crossbreeds were the Gibrim, i.e. the strong. Powerful. Now, Gibrim is the plural of Gibror. It is possible to assume a connection from the consonantal root between Gabriel and the semi-divine race of the Giborim. Was he a Gibor, Giver, of El, a man of power from the lineage of the Giborim or the Giverim, plural, or Giver? We do not possess a definitive answer, but we cannot but remember that a Gabriel is one who visits Mary and she becomes pregnant with Jesus. This biblical passage also provides an additional element of curiosity. Traditional translations say that Gabriel, Daniel 9:21, arrives flying fast. This biblical passage also provides an additional element of curiosity. Traditional translations say that Gabriel, Daniel 9:21, arrives flying fast. The biblical expression, however, does not refer to flight. Gabriel arrives being weary of weariness. The etymology of Yahaf recalls the sense of to strive to ascend, to strive to the point of exhaustion, Clark. The comprehensive etymological dictionary also quotes the verse above as given the following meaning of the verb Yahaf: utterly weary of weariness, klein. So the primary meaning of this verb is to make an effort, to be weary, to become tired, the feeling extreme tiredness. Even it can be assumed that he was a Gehever. Still, he was not exempt from the normal physiological functions of a material body that expends energy in its actions. So a traditional portrayal of Gabriel as an angel who comes along flying lightly is downright invented. He was simply tired. Daniel 10. In Daniel 10, the prophet receives revelation in the 3rd year of Cyrus's reign, 536 before Common Era, while he is with other people on the bank of the Tigris River. He lifts his eyes and sees Daniel 10:5-6. Man 1 being dressed linen. This figure had hips belted with gold from Uphaz, body like that of stone, tarsic topaz, 4 parts like Barak lightning, eyes like Lephide, torches of fire, arms and feet like the eyes of Nicoset, polished bronze, voice sound like the sound of Hamon, the rumbling produced by a multitude. Daniel 10:6. We note at once that this individual is not even called Malachim, but i.e., man. Daniel therefore sees a male individual whose appearance suggests some garment, shining in every part and covered within a woven linen tunic. This prompts us to return briefly to Ezekiel, as we find in this passage from Daniel an exciting cross-reference. Ezekiel 9 and 10 describe the movements of the chariot of God. Here we quote two verses in which the appearance of the chariot is accompanied by the presence of various people, one of whom corresponds what Daniel also sees, Ezekiel 9:2. Man 1 being dressed linen. As in the book of Daniel, this person occupies a prominent position. He is also equipped with writing tools. He is given special duties in Jerusalem. The text emphasizes twice that he is clothed in linen. Similarity between the individual Ezekiel sees and the individual Daniel encounters in the passage above suggests that we are likely dealing here with a high-ranking official, working under direct orders from Yahweh, possibly wearing a uniform that denotes his status. Did Ezekiel and Daniel see the same sick man? Was he a Gehever of hell? Did he hold a special position in the hierarchy of officers entrusted with particularly important tasks? Was he supposed to maintain contact with and carry information to the people chosen to be the spokesman of the Elohim? That is, the prophet? The prophets? The prophets? The term prophet, Navi, contrary to what is often thought, does not indicate one who foretells the future, but one who speaks on behalf of, that is, a spokesperson. Flavius Josephus and the Heavenly Armies. For more information on the Judeo-Roman history, Roman historian Flavius Josephus and his work, we refer to the glossary. However, we want to quote here an excerpt from his work, The Jewish War. It is about an event strikingly reminiscent of some of the passages we have encountered in our examination of the multiplicity of the Elohim. Between A.D. 66 and 70, Rome intervened to crush the rebellion that had broken out in Judea and in Jerusalem. The conflict ended with the conquest and destruction of the city by the Roman army commanded by Titus. The book recounts these events, and Flavius Josephus writes, "Not many days after the feast on the 21st of the month of Artemisius, a miraculous vision appeared that one would find hard to believe. In fact, I believe that what I am about to recount might appear to be a fable if it did not have the support of eyewitnesses, on the other hand, and the confirmation of the misfortunes that followed on the other. Before the sun went down, war chariots and armies of soldiers could be seen in the skies over the entire region, emerging from the clouds and surrounding the cities. Moreover, the feast called Pentecost, the priest who had entered the inner temple at night to perform the usual rites, reported that they first heard shaking and banging, and then a group of voices saying, 'From this place we are leaving.' 6 VI 5 296 to 299. Who is Flavius Josephus speaking about? Why does he claim that what was seen was extraordinary to the point of being unbelievable? Luckily, there was eyewitnesses, he claims, smugly. The phenomenon is thus undeniable. Who made up that celestial army? Who are the individuals that they want to leave? Are they the armies of the Elohim leaving their dominion forever? Furthermore, Flavius Josephus recalls that at an earlier time there appeared in the sky a sword-shaped star and a comet that lasted for a year, or when the people gathered for the feast of unleavened bread. At the 9th hour of the night, the altar and the temple were surrounded by such splendor that it seemed as if it were broad daylight, and the apparition lasted for half an hour. VI 5 289 to 290. We note an almost chronometric temporal precision in describing phenomenon related to celestial armies and unidentified presences, accompanied by astounding phenomena. Perhaps in his time, the watchers mentioned by Daniel were still there. Conclusion. In mass culture, a vast imaginary and visual repertoire of biblically accurate angels has spread, which has nothing to do with the Malachim of the Bible, i.e., the messengers commonly translated by the word angels. This popularized imagery also used the descriptions of the biblical cherubim, to which we will devote 2 chapters in this book, 14 and 15. As we shall see, Even the cherubim have nothing to do with angels, let alone biblically accurate angels. Therefore, neither the biblically accurate angels in contemporary visual culture, nor the more or less ancient theological reconstructions of angelic figures and hierarchies, nor the notions of angels widespread in popular piety have anything to do with these two biblical concepts. The Malachim and the Cherubim, to which they are traced back and around which unfounded theological, spiritual, and cultural information is derived, as shown in this chapter, the angels, Malachim, in the Bible are flesh and blood individuals whose physical difference from humans is noticeable, but at the same time, unmistakable and undeniable. The Malachim are more powerful than humans. They live in the camps whose access seems not to be permitted. They must ask questions in unforeseen situations. They perform functions in a practical nature. One of these functions is acting as Yahweh's spokesman, whose names they convey orders, give instructions, and communicate plans, and their human interlocutors, prophets, must share with the people. Again, it is not our intention to define or deny the existence of angels as spiritual beings, but to learn something about their representation in the Old Testament. Therefore, let us address the compelling question that inevitably arises after reading the biblical passages presented in this chapter, to which has been written about angels in religious, spiritualist, and devotional literature compatible with the figures of the Malachim presented in the Old Testament. We leave the question open, as we are sure to have provided enough material for everyone to make up their own mind. We want to conclude with a rapid foray into the New Testament, which is illuminating in many ways, in one of his letters, Paul of Tarsus writes, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." Hebrews 13:2. Men and angels are similar in appearance. Further comment is unnecessary. So there you go, people. I want to conclude with, what exactly are they hiding from you? If you really think about it, you know what I mean? If Jews know this shit, it's in the Hebrew, the context. It's evident that there's henotheism, that Satan is not real, that we're dealing with mortal flesh and blood beings, in which you have been told, and what you believe, and what the vast majority of people believe about the Bible, and their beliefs are false. And I believe it is our duty to educate ourselves on this, because the enemies know, the people who control the world know, and they're not telling you. And I think that this part of the Bible situation thing, quite frankly, in all seriousness, is the most important issue that nobody really talks about. Like I said, it took Dark Matter 2525, a good decade of his own damn career as an atheist skeptic, to come out and start talking about the old text and context. Static in the Attic is a YouTuber who's gotten to this, a few others. But this context matters because I'm pretty sure it's half the world's population of 8 billion people, so 4 billion around, believe in a variant of Abrahamism, and every version of their beliefs tend to be 99.99999% of the time complete false bullshit that has been orchestrated and curated with deceptive tactics and translations and narratives, propaganda being forced at the expense of death if you refuse. You have this whole narrative, and years of only having people only certain people of God could read the Bible, and then some people couldn't even read it all. So be wary, especially if you understand the JQ or anything else like that, because they clearly know a lot. Do you? Thank you for watching. That's about all. Peace out.